Questions. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 7712 in the name of Fergus Ewing on open cast mining, Scotland, coaling and restoring. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now, and I'll give a few seconds for people to settle down because I want to say something to members in advance of the debate. Thank you. Members will be aware that there is a live court case before the Court of Session on the issue of restoration. Members should therefore take care to avoid mention of the details of that case in their contributions. I call on Fergus Ewing to speak to move the motion. Minister, you've got 14 minutes, but we have a bit of time in hand today, so the presiding officers will be flexible.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I will take that advice very much in mind. As this chamber will be aware, the coal industry in Scotland has been experiencing a very tough time. Coal prices are low and operating costs are high, and two of Scotland's largest producers have folded in the past 12 months. As members know, this resulted in 732 jobs being lost, jobs which the communities in which they were located could ill afford to lose. I'm determined to work to find a solution that will take this sector through this difficult time. I've set up a cross-party national task force to tackle these issues. This is chaired by myself and Professor Russell Griggs, who has been working hard behind the scenes with all interested parties in the coal sector for the past year. The task force brings together many interested stakeholders: the local authorities affected, Scottish Government, energy planning and officials, operators, the trades unions, the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust, the Coal Authority and UK Government departments such as DEC and the Scotland Office. And it also has representation from many of the parliamentarians representing the affected areas. The task force remit is simple and straightforward with two objectives. One is to secure employment and protect what jobs we can for our rural communities in a more secure and sustainable way than has happened before. And secondly, to help to ensure appropriate restoration takes place. I want to talk about some of the progress made by the task force thus far. First, on employment. I am pleased to report to the Chamber that 153 former SRG employees have now gone into work, and that 117 of these employees are from East Ayrshire, the council most affected by redundancies, and 36 of those employees are from Lanarkshire. I am also pleased to report that Hargreaves have restated their plans to employ around 300 people in Scotland in their first 6 months of full operation, and that this estimate may rise to around 500 people in the next 12 months. Secondly, in training, the task force set up a short-term working group to look specifically at training and qualifications. Thanks to joint working with the PACE team, that's Partnership Action for Continuing Employment, thanks to the operators Hargreaves, the DWP and the SDS, through a pile of work for an officer that they have all done together, 184 former employees have started training through the Scottish Government Employability Fund, resulting in 97 qualifications being awarded. I'm also pleased to report that Hargreaves have now set up a driver training centre at their site in Broken Cross in South Lanarkshire, which has the capability to train 50 drivers per week. Thirdly, the Office of the Rail Regulator track access charging. Members will appreciate that ensuring the industry remains commercially viable is of key importance. That viability was put in doubt by the proposal from the Office of Rail Regulation for hugely increased track access charges of, I believe, £4.04 per 1,000 gross tonne miles proposed, now reduced to £1.04, not fully implemented until 2018. And I thank all parties that played a part for that. If the task force hadn't existed, I don't think this would have happened. But I also recognise the UK Government played a part, as did Transport Minister Keith Brown. Across parties there was a recognition of this threat, and to be fair, there was a commensurate response for which we are grateful. Not just yet. Fourthly, restoration. Presiding Officer, the task force is not just focused on jobs, it is also focused on restoration. Restoration is a part of the legacy left behind from the demise of ATH and SRG and is causing concern to all councils affected. Earlier this year, I announced the creation of the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust, an independent body created specifically to assist councils and other parties involved in the restoration of open-cast sites across Scotland. Its primary role will be that of facilitator, not funder, and it will seek to bring together all the relevant parties to tackle issues of restoration. I'm pleased that councils are already coming forward and receiving practical assistance from the SRT in the restoration plans. Now, restoration is a problem, Presiding Officer, which didn't arise yesterday and which will not be solved tomorrow. It is a complex one, but I'm pleased that the councils in Scotland, notably East Ayrshire, Fife, South Lanarkshire, Dumfries and Galloway and Midlothian, are working through each case on a site-by-site basis. For example, in Fife at Muirdean, an ex-ATH site, a restoration plan has been worked out and the restoration task is out to tender. This, Presiding Officer, will also help to create jobs. This is a good example of partnership with the Council, the UK Coal Authority, SEPA, local landowners and the bond provider coming together to ensure maintenance of the site whilst the restoration plan was developed. In Dumfries and Galloway at the Glenmucklock site, the restoration of the site is made possible by the coaling of an extension site, and only by the coaling of an extension site. So, continued coaling can secure employment, but it can also enable and facilitate restoration to happen. As excavation goes forward, the soils and overburden uncovered are used to restore that which is left behind. It took a great degree of innovative and pragmatic thinking to get to that position with the Glenmucklock site. None of this is easy, but it does serve to show that solutions can be found if all the parties are prepared to work together. There are productive ways of getting restoration carried out, and we have to look at each site on its own individually. In addition to the restoration measures that I've already mentioned, we are also exploring whether the levy paid to the Coal Authority could be applied for restoration. This is the levy per tonne of coal mined, currently 17p per tonne, and it was my understanding from information that was provided to the last meeting of the Coal Task Force, I believe by the Coal Authority, that only 1 penny of that out of 17p actually goes to the Coal Authority, with 16p going to the Consolidated Fund. We are, of course, talking about several £1 million here, Presiding Officer. So, therefore, I have written to UK Energy Minister Michael Fallon to ask whether this money can be made available to restore the open-cast sites in Scotland as it comes from the coal mined in Scotland. I'll give way to Willie Rennie. I'll be happy to give way to Patrick Harvie if he wishes to as well.
Does the Minister think it's appropriate that taxpayers' money should be used to fund the legacy that's been left by a failed coal mining industry? Do you think that's the good use of public funds?
Well, I don't know what Mr Rennie is referring to, because we don't apply taxpayers' money. What I was referring to is a levy by the industry, a levy that is paid from the industry to the UK government. It's got absolutely nothing to do with taxpayers' money. So I think unless Mr Rennie can illuminate us and enlighten us about where this alleged subsidy comes from in the opening address I believe he's about to make, and I invite him so to do, then I think that will be one of the many arguments that I think we may see is far from robust this afternoon from Mr Rennie and Mr Harvie. And I'm happy to take Mr Harvie if he wants to intervene.
Patrick Harvie.
I'm grateful. The Minister, I think, a few moments ago in talking about the track access charges in particular, said that he thought it was important to ensure that the industry remains commercially viable. Surely the phrase commercially viable implies that an industry is able to bear all of its own costs, whether that's in terms of running its business, transporting its goods, bearing its cost to access the rail network, or indeed the cost that it's imposed on communities up and down Scotland by paying in full for the restoration of all sites.
Minister.
Well, again, you know, Mr Harvie makes several assertions, but I don't think they stack up, because the coal industry is not subsidised. I mean, if Mr Harvie wants to argue otherwise, then we will hear from him in his closing remarks. But I do put this to Mr Harvie, and I hope that he and... well, hang on, I'm answering this just chat first. And I hope that he and Mr Rennie will put this quite squarely, because, you see, it does seem to me that the amendment which they are co-signing today would inevitably have the effect of destroying the open-cast industry in Scotland and leading to the almost immediate redundancy of several thousand people, the total destruction of the open cast industry in Scotland, because who is going to invest in Scotland's coal industry if there's a moratorium? Nobody is. And moreover, if that were to happen, what would the effect be? Well, the coal-fired power stations will still need coal, but it will come from Colombia. It will come from Russia. How is that good for the environment? I am really looking forward to explanation of some of these issues this afternoon. Now, getting back to where we were, more effective regulation. Every site, presiding officer, is different. There are rules in place for compliance, for monitoring, for enforcement, for financial assurance, but they do need to be made to work more effectively and tailored to each site. I believe that more effective regulation is the principal way of improving confidence in the sector. I believe, therefore, that the time is now right to consult on the options available to secure a more effective approach to restoration. I believe there's a role for the Scottish Futures Trust to advise on the financial aspects. There may also be a role for an independent compliance monitoring unit or for a local authority shared service. I shall ensure that the forthcoming consultation reaches out to all of those with a genuine interest, a productive interest, a positive interest in sustaining the industry in Scotland and the communities which are dependent upon them. Presiding officer, in conclusion, I believe that the story of the Scottish open cast sector over the past year does demonstrate what can be achieved in difficult circumstances when we work together, when all relevant stakeholders, including political parties, pull together. That we still have an open cast industry is testament to those efforts. Challenges remain. They are very substantial challenges indeed. No one can doubt that, not least to ensure that we get the best restoration solution possible for every site. But I do believe that with the trust that's been built up in the task force, with the joint working across parties in this chamber, especially the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, that I think working together we can find a better future for the open cast industry. And I hope, presiding officer, that when we support the Labour amendment at the end of the day, that it will also be supported by the Conservatives, and we will send out a very clear message that there is almost unanimity between the three parties that we can see a future for this industry and not its destruction.
Thank you very much. I now call on Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 7712.2. Ms Baker, 10 minutes, please, or thereby.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The current situation with open cast mining is a complex issue with, unfortunately, no easy answers. The precariousness of the industry must be addressed, and the challenge of restoration must be at the very heart of that. This week, the Scottish Government announced that they have granted consent to Magen Limited to develop the largest tidal turbine array in Europe and the first commercial offshore project off these shores. Scotland has great potential for a successful marine renewable energy industry and a renewables-focused energy sector. Our future energy needs must be met by a low-carbon economy, and we support government and industry efforts to grow this side of our energy economy. But we need to be realistic. We are in a transitional phase. Our current and short-term energy demands need to be met. Coal is still part of our energy mix, not least when we have Longanic coal-fired power station to feed. But it is part of our energy mix. It produces energy for 2 million people a year, and we need to get the balance right between investing in the plant to provide energy security and improve environmental performance, as well as shifting our dependency to more sustainable long-term energy delivery. Whether you are a supporter of open cast coal or not, the open cast coal sector has made a contribution to the Scottish economy. It is estimated to have supported around 4,500 direct and indirect skilled and well-paid jobs. These jobs primarily in areas which are already economically depressed. 75% of Scottish Coal's direct employment was in rural areas such as South Lanarkshire and East Ayrshire, where alternative employment opportunities could be limited. We cannot underestimate the impact that the demise of the deep coal mining has had on these areas. But while Scottish open cast coal output has been in the range of 5 to 8 million tonnes per annum over the last 10 years, with a third of total UK open cast coal production mined in Scotland in 2010, is an industry which has been facing increasing pressures. The cheap influx of overseas coal, particularly from Russia, has made it increasingly difficult to compete in the market and make the economics of the activity in Scotland stack up. The recommendation by the ORR on track access charges for rail freight added further pressure to the sector. The subsequent proposal to take coal out of Glenmuckloch on the local road network rather than rail is causing great concern for the local community. The inability of the sector to absorb or adapt to any kind of pressure, even in uncertain economic climate, indicated that all was not well. Although the collapse of Scottish coal earlier this year has been the headline story, for MSPs across the chamber who represent open cast coal areas, the sector has been vulnerable for a while. In my own region, ATH Resources underwent a number of restructurings, with staff either being made redundant or working in very uncertain situation until it collapsed earlier this year. My colleague Helen Eadie, who represents this area, will say more about the ongoing concerns, but that community deserves to have confidence that environmental concerns, including mine water pollution, will be dealt with. It is welcome that the Coal Authority has accepted responsibility for managing water discharge, but the site, like others, is still waiting for a permanent solution, and communities are often stuck in limbo, and it is vital these situations are resolved as soon as possible. I know that Fife Council are working with partners to secure a solution for all the Fife sites and take the matter of restoration very seriously. Other colleagues will talk about East Ayrshire, who are facing a desperate situation, and the Scottish Government must respond to their concerns. After this year's bad news, we are in a period of uncertainty where it has been important to respond quickly to the pressures and work together to provide a route through this time. We recognise the calls for an independent inquiry, but believe at this point in time we need to be focused on addressing the immediate challenges. Labour is focused on the employees and the need to secure future employment opportunities, as well as highlighting restoration and associated environmental concerns. I and Elaine Murray accepted an invitation to participate in the Open Cast Coal Task Force, and it has provided a forum for discussing the broad challenges which are facing the sector and taking forward some immediate concerns around assets such as training, restoration and the purchase of assets. There is a case now for adopting a more strategic response to the situation. If the task force is to serve a long-term purpose, it needs to adopt a more scrutiny role towards the sector. The Minister's announcement today of a consultation on more effective regulation is welcome, but there are opportunities to improve the system at the moment through the Scottish planning policy. The task force has also considered a limited application of state aid, but could the Minister today maybe give more details on the potential for some form of compatible aid, particularly where it could support environmental protection? I'd like to thank RSPB and Friends of the Earth for their briefing paper, as well as the Scottish Open Cast Communities Alliance. The challenge of restoration is huge, and the criticisms made of some of the agreements are justified. But we must also recognise that this situation does not always fail, and there are some positive examples of restoration. Restoration of sites is part of planning consent, and restoration bonds were put in place to cover the costs if necessary. Part of the work of the task force has been establishing whether these bonds are sufficient for meeting restoration costs, and if it is fair to say that the picture across Scotland is varied. It has been estimated that across Scotland the shortfall may be up to 100 million or more. There have been a combination of factors leading to this situation, but we must ensure accountability and responsibility in going forward. We cannot have a situation where communities who have lived alongside an open cast site cannot have confidence in restoration. As RSPB highlight, in addition, if restoration does not happen at mines which fall within European sites protected under the Habitats Directive, this could be in breach of EU wildlife law. Recently, the Court of Session accepted an application by the administrators, KPMG, to divest the assets of liability for restoration costs, and I understand the Scottish Government, along with SEPA, SNH and local authorities, are appealing that decision. The issue of the viability of the uncommercial or low productivity sites and their future and the risks we have of them being abandoned was addressed at the first meeting of the task force, with SEPA raising their concerns over this, and the task force wrote to KPMG raising concerns over cherry picking because of fears over what would be the future for the less lucrative sites. How do we address the future for these sites? The restoration of sites which aren't attracting commercial interest or where the bond is inadequate. Local authorities are not in a position to carry the burden of significant restoration work. It is fine to say that companies must meet their responsibilities, and I agree fully that they must be pursued relentlessly, but we also need to be realistic about the bankrupt state of some of the sector. We need to have credible solutions going forward. RSPB and Friends of the Earth have rightly raised concerns that open cast coal is not the only sector requiring restoration bonds. Landfall sites and future unconventional gas works will be facing similar challenges, so this does not look like a problem that is going to go away. There are calls for a moratorium on new open cast development. In the current circumstances, I'm not convinced a formal moratorium is necessary. Local authorities are well aware of their responsibilities and the challenges they face in dealing with existing sites without approving future work. And if I can quote the leader of Fife Council, he recently said, "Given the condition of the industry and worldwide drop in coal prices and our experience here in Fife, and indeed across Scotland, I am saying we have to be very careful with any future consents." Alec Rowley raised the issue of bonds at the last meeting of the Scottish Coal Task Force set up by the Scottish Government and asked the coal companies present if they'd be able to raise adequate bonds on future sites, and the answer was plainly no. So I think there is a real understanding across the local authority sector that they're extremely cautious in going forward. They are living with the bad experience in some cases of, I'm really pushed for time, I'm sorry, you do have a chance to sum up at the end. Open cast coal has been controversial. Energy projects often are, and have recently had debates over proposed unconventional gas and biomass projects. We must be confident the regulatory system is robust enough, is fair to all interests, and that there is accountability for decision making. The SPP3 is currently being finalised with 5 new principal policies covering sustainable economic growth, sustainable development, engagement, climate change and placemaking. In light of current events, this must be robust and meet the justified concerns of communities. The final draft that the Parliament considered recently did not adequately address concerns we are now seeing around future applications and provide the necessary confidence for community protection and restoration, as well as any developer's responsibility. Regardless of a regulatory review, the Scottish Government must revisit the Scottish planning policy in light of current circumstances. The Scottish Government has established the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust, which is well-intentioned. Presiding Officer, do you have...
if you wish.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. Would the member therefore welcome the fact that I have extended the review of Scottish planning policy until June of next year to take forward the number of consultations, not least this one?
Claire Baker.
I would welcome that, and I hope the Minister will look carefully at our amendment and recognise where we identify the weaknesses in relation to open cast restoration. The Scottish Government has recently established the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust, which is well-intentioned, but there are concerns of the lack of detail on how this is going to work. An independent organisation formed to help facilitate the process of communities and other stakeholders involved in the legacy of open cast coal sites. It has a role of offering advice, expertise and, where appropriate, funding to facilitate plans for restoration of derelict sites. It is not a grant awarding body, its funds are very limited, and it's not yet clear what advice or sources of funding it can offer. There is potential has been recognised for job creation and restoration, and the process could have multiple benefits for communities. The Trust has described the situation as one needing an innovative or creative approach to using the resources already in place for each site. But it's unclear how this will operate, and perhaps until there is a project underway, it's difficult to appreciate how it will work. But this does not provide the confidence which is needed for all partners. I look forward to this afternoon's debate, and I move the amendment in my name as a positive contribution to the way forward in the interests of communities, our environment and meeting our future energy needs.
Many thanks. And I now call on Willie Rennie to speak to and move Amendment 7712.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey. Mr Rennie, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Today, Patrick Harvey and I have come together to amend the Government's motion, and I've returned from my party's conference in Glasgow to participate in this debate. And it's 2 unusual steps, but I think they're necessary to make the case, I think, against the Government's misguided actions. But can I also apologise to the Chamber for not being able to stay for the summation of the debate, as I'm required back in Glasgow. So I apologise to the Chamber for that. Just a sec. Far from getting tough with the industry, as we've heard in the papers and on the news this morning, I think the Minister needs to get a reality check. What he's doing is desperately propping up failing mines, and that risks further environmental damage to compound the damage that communities have already been exposed to. Look, I'm a supporter of the Scottish Government's renewable energy and climate change ambitions with world-beating targets. But after my experience of the Scottish Government's failure to meet the last two sets of annual targets, and now its approach to the collapse of the open-cast coal mining industry, I'm beginning to doubt its commitment to the environment. The world price of coal has dropped as a result of American operators dumping on the world market because of the dramatic increase in fracking in the States. The technology used in fracking looks like it's going to be extended rather than limited in the years ahead, which could depress coal prices even further. Now, even if the price does not go down, it's unlikely to increase sufficiently to deliver a long-term resurgence for the industry here. The industry knows that, and so does its insurance market. That's why Hargreaves has created hivecos for each site that it now has. These are small entities which, if they fail, do not have any contaminant effect on the wider Hargreaves company. Hargreaves clearly do not have the confidence to take these mines directly into their company, but want to keep them one removed in case of a future collapse. Yes.
I mean, surely the point is that Hargreaves are investing, and investing very substantially, their money in coaling and Scotland. And just to avoid doubt, does Mr Rennie and Mr Harvey, do they accept that the effect of their amendment, which calls on the Scottish Government to have an immediate halt on new open-cast coal development, would be to terminate the open-cast coal sector in Scotland?
Mr Rennie.
The Minister is wrong. That is not the effect of the motion. This is for new applications, and he knows that, and he's trying to misinterpret what the actual amendment says. But what the company, what Hargreaves are doing, is they're limiting their liability. They're limiting their liability by creating these hivecos. So if they collapse, it does not have effect on the wider company. That does not inspire me with confidence. If they had confidence in the sector, they would take these mines into their operations fully and not half-heartedly. No, not just now. It's also why the insurance companies have, to a great extent, closed the bond market for open-cast coal. They know there is a high chance of companies collapsing again and believe the risk is far too high. We should hear their warnings. We need to listen to what these people have got to say, but the government seems not prepared to listen to them. It's desperate, the government, to keep the industry alive, even if it creates more significant problems in the future. And the problems just now are already severe. Mines dotted across the country, left derelict, polluted water, massive spoil heaps dwarfing communities. And the failed coal companies have not put enough, and they've not put enough bonds and sufficient funds in place to cover the restoration costs. The situation in East Ayrshire, which the Minister did not refer to, the report last week that showed the situation is far worse than it was first thought, I think would have deserved some recognition in his opening remarks. In West Fife, I was repeatedly told 5 years ago that the lessons, not just now, the lessons of the past had been learned. And then planning applications were granted, new open-cast mines were opened up, but 5 years later, we have got many mines that have been left derelict. That is not acceptable. The Scottish Government seems determined, not just now, the Scottish Government seems determined to ignore these lessons again. It's why I am concerned that the Scottish Government is looking to provide financial assistance to Hargreaves through Scottish Enterprise. And I'd like to hear, not just now, I'd like to hear in his summing up, I'll look in the official report later, to hear what the Minister has got to say about Scottish Enterprise's financial contribution to Hargreaves. And whatever the sum is, I question the doubt. If the Minister could explain, that would be helpful.
Well, Scottish Enterprise deals with things independently and looks at every company in the same way without fear, favour or discrimination. Any other approach would be illegal. But how can Mr Rennie say that if there's no more coaling, there can still be an open cast industry. If there is to be a halt on further open cast mines getting permissions, how can he argue that that is anything other than a mass P45 for 4,500 people directly and indirectly employed in the sector?
There's a huge distraction by the Minister. He does not recognise the failings that he has made to not learn the lessons from the past. He needs to look to the past to learn the lessons for the future, but he is refusing to do so. The Minister is looking at trying to get money through the fees, the licensing fees that have been paid to the UK government. That money could be used for other things, but the Minister wants to use it to pay for the legacy, the failed legacy of the mining industry in Scotland. He also, so on the one hand, he also wants to do is to clear up their mess and then give them more money to create more mess in the future. This is a very short-sighted attack. I'm afraid I'm running out of time. Of course I want to clean up the mines, but we should not do that at the cost of future environmental legacy. These are the problems that the Minister should be working to try and resolve. The pay-as-you-extract scheme also shifts responsibility from the industry to other people. If we do not get sufficient funds together from the pay-as-you-extract scheme, which the Minister is proposing, what we will end up with is the state or communities having to pick up the tab for future failures. So I've got some simple asks for the Minister. He needs to recognise, like East Ayrshire, that we have to have an independent inquiry into the collapse of the industry. All new planning applications should be halted. The pay-as-you-extract scheme should be abandoned and no public funds should be invested in Hargreaves. If the government wants to restore its environmental reputation, which through this episode has been severely damaged, it needs to take these reasonable steps. Thank you very much. Sorry, I move the motion.
Thank you. I now call on Murdo-Fraser. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the Government's motion today and the opportunity to debate this very important issue which touches on communities across Scotland. When I saw the Government motion, Deputy Presiding Officer, I thought this would be a rather consensual debate with parties across the Chamber coming together to agree a way forward for an industry that employs so many people. I didn't reckon with Willie Rennie breaking through the ring of steel around the Liberal Democratic conference in Glasgow and making his way along the M8 to join us in concert with Patrick Harvie with their joint scorched earth approach towards the coal industry. Perhaps I will need to check back the TV clips from the 1980s and the famous confrontation during the miners' strike. Perhaps if we look closely, we will see a youthful and diminutive Patrick Harvie joined by a youthful Willie Rennie on the picket line with placards urging the National Core Board and Margaret Thatcher's government to go further and faster in closing down the coal mines than they plan to do. I think we should reject such a pseudo-Thatcherite approach, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we should support the coal industry in Scotland, which has a very important role in driving Scotland's economy. Because in addition to the sums extracted and the thousands of jobs provided across regions like my own in Fife, it's worth noting that even today, around 40% of Scotland's electricity comes from coal. It forms one part of a broad energy mix, which provides us with security of supply and stability of price, and is likely to retain this status for many years to come. But we have, as the Minister set out, seen an unprecedented collapse in the Scottish open cast industry. It has suffered at the hands of a perfect storm, with rising costs and falling global prices creating pressures which have overwhelmed even well-established companies. But coal still has a future. As demand in the expanding economies of the BRIC countries increases, we can also point to a growing market closer to home. In Germany, following the decision, a decision I fundamentally disagree with, incidentally, of the government to close its nuclear plant, they are going down the road of opening 6 new coal power stations this year, with more in the pipeline before 2020. Now, to me, it is utterly misguided to be closing down low-carbon sources of energy and replacing them with high-carbon sources of energy. But it does disprove the line in Patrick Harvie's amendment when he says that the market for coal is declining. It is quite the opposite. The world market for coal is far from declining. There are still great opportunities there. Yes, happily.
Patrick Harvey.
Unless Murdo Fraser is going to go the direction of some of his colleagues at Westminster at the moment and actually call for the scrapping of climate change legislation, it's very clear that coal use in energy generation will bear increasing costs if we have anything like an energy policy that's capable of achieving those targets. Does he not accept that this is going to be an increasingly expensive product to burn?
Murdo Fraser.
Produces more CO2. There's no disagreement about that. All I was pointing out that there's a factual inaccuracy in Patrick Harvey's amendment, because in fact demand for coal across the world is not decreasing. And if Patrick Harvey is concerned about CO2 emissions, Deputy Presiding Officer, I suggest we look at what's happened in the US, where fracking for shale gas has substantially reduced not just CO2 emissions, but also costs to the consumer and to industry. Now, let's get back to the point in hand. What do we do about the mining industry here in Scotland? I welcome the creation of the Coal Industry Task Force by the Minister, which I'm privileged to be a part of. And it's been, as the motion points out, an excellent example of constructive partnership working between a diverse assortment of public bodies at UK, Scottish and local level, joining with industry and trade union representatives. And I think we should be pleased with the progress being made, even in the short time that it's existed. Now, the key issue I think we have to tackle is this troublesome question of restoration, as the Minister said. It is an issue which, with proper oversight, should not have arisen. If we look at the Scottish Government's 2010 Scottish Planning Policy document, we see it indicates that planning authorities should require a financial guarantee to ensure adequate restoration and aftercare. That should. It doesn't say may or can, it says should. So these agreements should be in place before planning permission has been granted, and we know that sometimes that did not happen in the past, and it's clear now that existing restoration bonds have been insufficient to meet the bill for projects which have recently collapsed. And local communities, many of them initially sceptical, I quite accept this, about having open cast mining in their backyard, are now concerned they will be picking up the bill, perhaps through their council tax, for the restoration of the landscape to its original condition. Now, there have been various suggestions as to how we should deal with this question of restoration guarantees for the future. It seems to me the central principle should always remain that the minimum of cost should fall to the taxpayer, because these are commercial operations. Concerns have been expressed previously about the possibility of pay-by-extraction schemes, the suggestion being that these would by no means guarantee the restoration costs throughout the entire lifetime of a project, and I have a great sympathy for those concerns. And I also appreciate we are walking a very fine line between providing appropriate assurances that all foreseeable eventualities are prepared for and placing insurmountable burdens on a productive injury. And there is a balance to be struck between necessary regulation, but also ensuring that open cast mining continues to provide much needed jobs and revenue in different parts of the country, which have perhaps faced a difficult economic situation in recent years. So I welcome, Deputy Presiding Officer, the work being done by the Coal Industry Task Force. I welcome the discussions taking place under the auspices of the Restoration Bond Working Group, and we look forward to seeing more detail coming forward. I'm heartened by the creation of the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust and the initial cast injection it has received. We recognise that restoration projects are far from straightforward, so providing support, sharing expertise and a point of contact for stakeholders to seek advice will, I hope, ensure improvements in restoration strategy and techniques across Scotland. Deputy Presiding Officer, the objectives which the Government has outlined in today's motion are sensible and reasonable. We share with them an appreciation for the work of the industry and the need for a positive approach in its current problems. And we disagree fundamentally with the approach taken by the Liberal Democrats and Greens in this debate, because we believe open cast mining in Scotland has a future. The responsibility now falls to us to provide the correct structures to secure that future, and I am pleased to support the Government motion and the Labour amendment. Thank you.
Many thanks. And before we move to open debate, I would just remind the Chamber that we have a little time in hand which will allow for a judicious amount of interventions. Adam Ingram to be followed by Claudia Beamish, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The subject matter of this debate is of vital interest to the communities I represent in East Ayrshire. The scale of coal operations in this area is very significant. In 2012, open cast coal production in East Ayrshire represented 15% of the total coal production of the UK. That's including underground mining. For open cast mining alone, East Ayrshire produced over 25% of all UK coal and 53% of that produced in Scotland. Consequently, both the economic and environmental impact of these activities are highly significant. The collapse of 2 out of the 3 coal companies operating in the coal field can only be described as disastrous. The full economic impact of the crisis visited on local communities is currently being assessed in detail, and as I understand it, a report will be published by East Ayrshire Council later this week. But what we do know now is that some 311 East Ayrshire residents and former Aardvark and Scottish Coal employees have been made redundant, and that there are many more jobs in the local supply chain under threat. In these circumstances, coalfield communities must not be left in the lurch as they were in the 1980s with the wholesale closure of the deep mines. We must diversify the local economy and realise opportunities to both develop existing business and attract inward investment. And the Minister will be aware of the efforts of East Ayrshire Council and Scottish Enterprise to create a proposition for economic initiatives which will require Scottish Government backing, and I hope and trust this will be forthcoming. But so long as a viable coal industry can be sustained, we should be lending our efforts to that purpose as a matter of priority. I am grateful to the Minister for his strong leadership in that regard and his swift action in establishing a coal industry task force, mobilising all those national agencies and local authorities alike who could provide support in getting people who had lost their jobs back into work. The Minister has also done well, in my view, in establishing a good working relationship with remaining reputable companies in the mining sector, particularly Keir Mining and Hargreaves Surface Mining Limited, who have now acquired certain former Scottish Coal and Aardvark sites. In doing so, Hargreaves managed to maintain coaling at the Aardvark sites, and recruitment is underway to restart operations at the Scottish Coal sites. And I understand, as the Minister mentioned, 300 to 500 jobs will be created nationwide as a consequence over the next year. That said, it would be idle to pretend that the legacy from previous open cast operators is nothing other than a bitter one. It would appear that Scottish Coal in particular failed to fulfil its obligation in a number of areas. For example, it quickly became apparent to the PACE and local response teams that Scottish Coal had failed to train and certificate levels of competence in its workforce which would allow employees to secure equivalent jobs out with the company. Thankfully, Skills Development Scotland, with the assistance of the Minerals Products Qualifications Council and Hargreaves, are ensuring the acquisition of these crucial red tickets, as they're called. Now, the issue of restoration, or more accurately, lack of restoration, is proving to be far more problematic. What is clear is that both Aardvark and Scottish Coal failed to restore sites as they were obliged to do under their original planning consents, nor were restoration bonds sufficient to cover the costs of restoration put in place. The local planning authority is equally blameworthy in this failure, given their duty to monitor and enforce, where appropriate, planning conditions. This is a galling outcome, given the time and effort I recall put into drawing up East Ayrshire's open cast coal subject plan some 10 years ago. There were adequate tools in the toolbox, Presiding Officer, but to ensure that this problem didn't arise, but they were not used effectively, and I support East Ayrshire Council's investigation of this matter. The review, which has been conducted independently by Jim McKinnon, the former Chief Planner, will, I am sure, inform Scottish planning policy which is currently out to consultation, as we've heard. I would also welcome the Minister's announcement of a consultation on more effective regulation of the industry, particularly with regards to the financial assurance of restoration guarantees. It is unacceptable.
Always bearing in mind that this is a matter for the courts.
I don't think this specific matter is for the courts, presiding officer. I find it unacceptable that in East Ayrshire we have been left with a notional bill of £161 million to restore former open cast sites to a state agreed at planning consent. But total restoration bond coverage amounts to only something like £29 million. Clearly, we need alternative restoration plans which, as a minimum, will make unrestored sites safe and will make good any ongoing environmental pollution. And I am hopeful that the recently formed Scottish Mines Restoration Trust will facilitate implementation of these plans. Equally clearly, we need a functioning industry to ensure this task can be achieved. Closing down the industry would remove the workforce, the equipment, and the expertise required for the job. The Green amendment, supported by the Liberal Democrats, is therefore akin to an exercise in cutting off our nose to spite our face and should be rejected. Thanks very much.
Many thanks. Now call on Claudia Beamish to be followed by Annabel Ewing, a generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today is a very important debate for many communities across Scotland, and I want to focus on how open cast impacts on communities, the jobs and the economic future for affected families and communities, and the challenges of restoration past and present. Scottish Labour's amendment welcomes moves to identify improvements in the regulatory regime of the industry, including appropriate protection for communities and the environment. And I hope the Minister will take this into account in relation to the forthcoming consultation. It is frankly a relief to many that the Scottish Government will shortly hold a consultation into more effective regulation. Mining communities across the Scottish coalfield were devastated by the closure of deep mines, as we all know, then started to be subjected to the environmental effects of a new form of coal gaining, open cast. This was and still is an environmental justice issue. The issue has come back into the public awareness due to the collapse of major companies. There are still practices which are far from perfect. As founding convener in the early 90s of Scottish Open Cast Action Group, I fought along with others to get the guidelines changed to better protect communities. In those days, a perimeter fence came close to people's gardens. This was changed and a 200-metre buffer zone was negotiated. Is this enough? We also argued that dust does not stop at the perimeter fence, and this has not changed. We also worked with Scottish Wildlife Trust and others to identify how to protect local environments which were precious, such as Ponfief Burn in South Lanarkshire, where residents played as children, courted, then pushed buggies or walked with sticks in later years. Noise was a concern then and still is. Only last week a constituent told me that the noise at Broken Cross site was manageable by day to his family, but not by night. Back then, road safety was an issue, with coal lorries on such roads as the A70 in Clydesdale. Talk of taking the coal off the roads onto rail has rarely become a reality. The issue of cumulative effect of sites was addressed. Should this be revisited? SOAG and other groups also broached the issue of restoration bonds. The Scottish Government consultation will now be the focus of a very hard look at this issue, in addition to the task force subgroup. In the days of the open cast executive before privatisation, some would argue that bonds were working. Others believe that, somewhat like bus deregulation, the legislation at this time was suspect, with all the strength on the side of the operators as things changed. The court direction on whether the administrators can abandon or disclaim sites and former sites, thereby transferring... I think you are venturing into areas of sub judice. Please be aware of the risks attached to yourself in so doing. Yeah. Thereby possibly transferring ownership was indeed deeply disappointing, as I said at the time, and the appeal by SEPA, South Lanarkshire, Ayrshire and others East Ayrshire and others, is anxiously awaited by councils and communities alike. If the appeal fails, these communities cannot be left amid a broken industry. Whatever the mistakes of councils as regulators, allowing work to proceed with insufficient bonds in some cases, communities cannot be expected to languish in such circumstances. And councils cannot be expected to resolve this issue alone. The costs will obviously be prohibitive, whatever the mistakes, and the cost on other services would be dangerous to already deprived communities. Putting together those with valuable experience and advice is necessary. However, in the words of the Minister today, the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust is a facilitator, not a funder. Is this right when one looks at the enormity of the task? Further Scottish Government support is needed. Since the times of deep mining, these communities' contribution has been at the core of UK prosperity over the years. In the spirit of a United Kingdom, which is best represented by the pooling of resources to help the challenges of those in need, then those communities, amid a broken industry, must go indeed to the mender of last resort, and the UK Government might have to play its part in this funding restoration, not just in relation to the Coal Authority in the end. If this happens, consideration, in my view, should be given to the benefit to the communities and the local government, the local environment as restoration proceeds. The Scottish Government should recognise... I do think
that you are steering into areas that are matters for the case. That is an open case, so please be aware.
All right, thank you, Presiding Officer. My understanding was that I was talking about the possibility of the UK Government helping with funds, but thank you for your advice. The Scottish Government should recognise that this is one of the strengths of being in the United Kingdom. In the words of Gordon Brown, we have a partnership where we pool and share resources so that when there are areas of great need, we can intervene to help them. Looking to the future of restoration bonds, while there has been much bad practice over the years, there's also been good models, as highlighted by others. Very briefly.
Dennis Robertson.
By the UK government?
Claudia Beamish.
I most certainly would, and I would certainly disassociate myself from anything to do with that, because I certainly was not part of that government. In fact, I was fundraising and supporting the miners in that situation. As the hole got deeper, the bonds got higher in some places, such as in West Lothian with ECOS regeneration, in the case of Heartlands, where work was signed off by the compliance officer and reports made to the compliance liaison officer. It could also be useful for the task force to look in more detail at the operating, as I know they've already started to do, of Keir and Banks, where I understand there are no outstanding sites left unrestored. The combination of progressive restoration and sufficient bonds must be the way forward, and Mid Lothian Council is at the moment looking at a phased restoration as an option. East Ayrshire's independent inquiry has been welcomed by the RSPB. I'm aware of calls for a moratorium, but I'm absolutely clear that while this is not our position at the moment in Scottish Labour, that whatever else the application criteria are in the future, no site in Scotland should be consented unless there is sufficient bond for outstanding work on any previous site being worked by the same company. Scottish Coal employed 350 people directly in South Lanarkshire. I'm sure this whole Parliament recognises the challenges faced by those who have been made redundant. I'm very aware of the support that's been offered by PACE, and I welcome the Driver Training Centre at Broken Cross. Some have taken the opportunity to open businesses and diversify, but there is still a pressing need for support. And for the longer term, in terms of recovery, there is a need to broaden the business base. There must also be a clear strategy for a just transition to a low-carbon economy, as highlighted by my colleague Claire Baker in opening. The targets agreed across this Parliament will address climate change and fuel poverty at once as our industries adapt in the energy sector. In the longer term, we have an obligation to ensure that those jobs that are in the exploitation of fossil fuel, those in those jobs are offered training to transferable skills, that some of the opportunities for manufacturing and the whole range of new technologies for energy and energy efficiency and installing them can come to those beleaguered communities who are in need of our support today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Annabel Ewing to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And as the SNP MSP for Mid Scotland and Fife, I am pleased to be able to make a contribution to this afternoon's debate. and of course the importance of the coal industry to several parts of the Mid-Scotland and Fife region, and in particular to the Kingdom of Fife, is well known, and of course it goes to the very fabric of Fife and its economic and social history. And at the present day, that interest is focused on the coaling that can still be carried out and the concomitant jobs that are involved in that, and of course on the restoration of sites, which will also involve not just the vital issue of environmental clean-up itself, but also, hopefully, local jobs. And the fact that these two key objectives have been recognised by the Scottish Government is, I think, to be welcomed. And this has been manifest, as we have heard today, in the establishment by the Minister of the Scottish Coal Industry Task Force, co-chaired by the Minister and the hugely respected Professor Russell Griggs. And the membership of this task force is rightly, in my view, wide-ranging and has worked and is working collaboratively to find solutions to the various problems with which it has to deal. And I would like to highlight two of the successes that have been referred to already this afternoon. One is the issue of freight access charges and the very successful lobbying of the Office of Rail Regulation to ensure that the original massive hike proposed of an additional charge of some £4 a tonne was reduced to a proposed increase of £1.04 a tonne. For the original proposal, Presiding Officer, if it had gone forward, would have had a disastrous consequence for the viability of the coal industry in Scotland and on the prospects for the future development of clean coal electricity generation and therefore on jobs. Another success story of the task force to date is the important issue, as referred to by the Minister, of qualifications and the need to ensure that the skills and experience acquired on the part of former employees of SRG who had been made redundant could be duly recognised absent the existence of any formal qualifications. That's a very important issue for the individuals concerned. So the successes to date have shown how practical steps taken across the sector, with everyone working together, can make a real difference in improving the prospects for those currently working in the industry and for those who have had to seek alternative employment at this time. And of course, as we have been hearing from many speakers this afternoon, alongside the task force has been set up the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust. And that body, of course, is independent and has been tasked with facilitating solutions, innovative, dynamic solutions to the problem we face with respect to restoration. I welcome the setting up of this body, for it is implicit that in finding solutions, it is not simply a case of one council seeking to act alone without any input from other people. Councils working together across the areas affected, bringing in the public and private sector with a pooling of expertise and best practice shared across the sector. I think that is a very worthwhile approach indeed. And it is axiomatic, Presiding Officer, that there is no identikit fix for each site concerned. And rather, the specificities of each site must be duly taken into account to find a solution. And it is also, I believe, at least in the real world, obvious that the complex issues involved require solutions that will inevitably take some time. There is sadly no magic wand that we can wave at this issue overnight, a point recognised by many, including by Fife Council. And Fife Council have been, as Claire Baker mentioned, involved in these discussions. They've been involved in these discussions for quite some time through the task force and with a variety of stakeholders. So, as we have heard, with respect to the Muirdean site by Crossgates, tender has now been issued for restoration works. And I think that is a credit to the hard work of all those involved, including all the officials behind the scenes, to get to that stage. And it is the hard work of these individuals that will make the difference, not, Presiding Officer, the issuing of sound bites. And I think it is a pity that Mr Rennie did not consider staying for the entirety of this debate to be a priority in his diary, given that we are talking about the future of the coal industry in Scotland and the importance of that to people in Fife. And it's a pity also that we don't see and have not seen in this debate any other Liberal Democrats seeking to participate. What I would have asked if Mr Rennie had had the courtesy of taking any interventions from backbenchers, and several of us tried to intervene, was to ask Mr Rennie if his new Lib Dem policy to end coaling, which would turf thousands of people out of their jobs, was a Scotland-only policy, not to be applicable in the rest of the United Kingdom. And, Presiding Officer, with just about 1 year to go to the independence referendum, I don't think the people of Scotland have got much to look forward to if that is the Lib Dem vision for the future of the people of our country, including those who work in the open cast coaling sector. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would wish to welcome the announcement today, first by the Scottish Government, as to whether we can seek to recover the levy paid by the coal industry to the Coal Authority, most of which, as we have heard, goes to the Consolidated Fund. This money could be well used to help with restoration works in Scotland, and I do hope that, notwithstanding the Lib Dems' opposition to such a move, we might get support from some of the other parties on that issue. At the same time, I also very much welcome the Scottish Government's decision to consult on how we can, going forward, secure better regulation and therefore a more effective approach to restoration. In my view, Presiding Officer, that is the practical way forward, and that is the way that we can best seek to find solutions for communities in Fife and elsewhere in Scotland. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Graham Pearson to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Presiding Officer, I rise to support the motion as amended by Claire Baker. I also acknowledge the approach from the Minister in recognising the complexity of what we discussed this afternoon and his case-by-case approach in relation to the problems it raises. Thirdly, I acknowledge all that Adam Ingram has said in terms of its impact on East Ayrshire Council particularly, and would seek to flesh out some of those impacts in order that the Minister might consider further. There are currently 1,468 hectares of abandoned, disturbed, unrestored land across the council area. 524 hectares of land classified as voids. A void can be a deep chasm 50 metres in depth with water at its bottom. What does that look like to you and I? It's been described elsewhere as being like 4,000 football pitches end to end. Both these classifications represent a real danger to the public in terms of health and safety, and both categories dampen any future development opportunities in economic terms. In 2012, the Scottish Coal Company Limited approached East Ayrshire Council to seek a business rates holiday. This was another clue that something was going badly wrong within the company. East Ayrshire has suffered the disruption accompanying open cast mining for generations. It provided the location much of the workforce and has suffered the inconvenience, and to this day continues to pay for the presence of the industry in its midst. All this done to provide coal and thereby energy for Scotland and United Kingdom's economic well-being. No one volunteers to have an open cast mine development on their doorstep. It is dirty, it is dangerous, it's dust-laden industry. However, without open cast mining, East Ayrshire would be even poorer than it currently is, and that's saying something given the jobs that have transferred out of the area and the paucity of inward investment. East Ayrshire has one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in the country at 12.2% for young people out of work. That compares with 7.2% in Scotland and for the UK 6.1%. The current SNP Council has failed in its duty of proper governance to provide a level of accountability and responsibility on the part of SCCL and other companies. In fairness, though, successive local authority administrators have failed in this regard, including Labour. That, however, does not mean the people of East Ayrshire should bear the burden to fix this problem on their own. Yes, we need a commitment to an annual mining plan for each area affected by developments. Yes, we need annual checks to ensure an environmental audit and verify compliance with the environmental conditions continue to apply. Welcome the Minister's commitment today to more effective regulation for the future. But as importantly, The Government must offer their colleagues in East Ayrshire Council some financial comfort now to begin the rebuilding of this blighted area if it is to have any hope in competing in the future. The current Scottish Government stance appears to abandon East Ayrshire Council to deal with the costs of repairing the landscape and dealing with the voids. If this happened, the costs across the council area equates to a per capita cost of between £1,600 and £5,000. Current estimates of the costs were mentioned earlier, of up to £161 million. Another estimate would say it's between £71 and £113 million. In either case, it's far too much for the council to bear on their own, given that guarantee bonds to cover the work appear to total somewhere around £28.5 million. Who is to bear those costs? Apparently, currently not the companies. It is East Ayrshire Council, then, who need to allocate what would be a third of their entire budget to repairing this property.
The allocation of costs is a matter for the court, as I understand it. So please keep off that subject.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In its own report, East Ayrshire Council acknowledged previous enforcement of these matters has not been to the standard expected, and thus monitoring of these matters by the Planning Authority requires to be robust now and in the future. The Scottish Coal Industry Task Force has met on 4 occasions with the Minister as its chair. Will the Minister state precisely how he tends to deal with the financial tsunami faced by East Ayrshire Council? 311 employees of Aardvark and SCCL have been made redundant in this chaos. What will the Government do to support them as innocent, hard-working victims? Remaining assets are being picked over by private interests. Is it ethical, decent and honest to expect the communities of East Ayrshire to bear responsibility for the clean-up, or will the Government step forward and assist? Of the 4.8 tonnes of coal extracted in Scotland, 2.5 million tonnes of them came from East Ayrshire. In fact, more coal is developed in open cast from East Ayrshire than from the whole of Wales, and almost the same amount as in England. It's scandalous, and it is an embarrassment to East Ayrshire Council, the UK and Scottish governments, and it's a pressure being unfairly faced by the people of East Ayrshire if no solution is provided in the short term. What discussions will the Scottish Government have with the UK Government to ensure this is not repeated? Can the Minister give an assurance of an enterprise zone status for East Ayrshire and assist the area in reclaiming a future? Will he reconsider his previous decision to offer the area no financial contribution towards repairing the environmental damage which has arisen? Remember, it's 4,000 football pitches in size. It needs some kind of response. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now call on Mike Mackenzie to be followed by Chick Brodie.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to speak in this debate because although there's not any significant production of coal in the Highlands and Islands region, it's still widely used there as a fuel. And for this and other reasons, I'm sorry to say at the outset that I cannot support Mr Harvey's amendment. Most of our homes across the Highlands and Islands are off the gas grid, and electrical heating, although convenient, can be prohibitively expensive. Many people across the Highlands and Islands are therefore dependent on fossil fuels, a fact that Mr Harvey might find inconvenient. And of course, Mr Harvey is keen on renewable energy generation, and I share and possibly even exceed his enthusiasm for renewable technologies. But the fact of the matter, as Claire Baker, I think, correctly suggested, renewable energy generation is not yet sufficiently developed to provide low-cost heating across the Highlands and Islands. I believe that ultimately it will be, and the sooner the better. But even in my most optimistic moods, I have to accept that may not be for a few years yet. I'm sure that Mr Harvey would agree that the UK Government's inordinate delays in finalising energy market reform do not help to achieve this aim. Certainly.
Harvey.
I go along with some of what he says, but would he at least accept that if we were talking about protecting coal for those small number of households who need to use coal in their home because they're not on the gas grid and it's their only source, we'd be talking about a minuscule fraction of the amount that's actually extracted in Scotland?
Mike Mackenzie. This is only a very, one small argument that you may not have considered that's very relevant, though, to the Highlands and Islands. I intend to make some further arguments that I hope you'll listen to and consider. Presiding Officer, members will know that Scotland's rural areas, and particular islands, suffer fuel poverty to a greater degree than urban areas. On some of our islands, fuel poverty has reached an unacceptable level of 50%. And this is due to a combination of factors, amongst which are fuel transport costs, low wages and hard to insulate homes. For good reasons, coal remains for many people the fuel of choice. On the island where I live, we have an annual coal day when we all work together and bring the year's supply of coal across. And only a very few years ago, we achieved this by dint of very hard manual labour. Our community of only 60 souls uses around 60 tonnes of coal a year, and each bag would have to be handled at least 6 times down piers, on and off boats and dumpers before it reached our homes. But nowadays, we have an easy time. Technology has solved most of this back-breaking problem for us. We use an all-terrain forklift, machines which just weren't around only a decade or so ago, and now we let the hydraulics do the heavy lifting. I therefore cannot agree with Mr Harvey and Mr Rennie that we should just close down Scotland's coal industry. Just as technology has solved our back-breaking coal delivery problem, so with carbon capture and storage and other clean coal technologies, no, I've already taken one intervention. Technology will solve the pollution problems of coal and other fossil fuels. That will be and should be the effect of Scotland's climate change legislation, to create this imperative, but to do so in a way that does not destroy jobs or industries. And just as we should and can rise to these technological challenges, I cannot believe that it's beyond our wit or ability to provide a framework of regulation that makes sure that environmental damage is minimised and that the landscapes of open cast mines are properly restored when they are exhausted. Presiding Officer, I didn't expect to be upstaged by Mr Fraser this afternoon, particularly not on this issue, but it seems to me that Mr Harvey would shut down open coal with the same relish that Margaret Thatcher shut down coal mining, without regard for jobs, without regard for livelihoods, and without regard for communities. I welcome the Scottish Government's approach, which, by contrast, challenges our ingenuity to solve these problems in ways which preserve our jobs and leave open our energy options for the future.
Thanks very much. Now calling Chuck Brodie to be followed by Helen Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, more often than not, one stands to say when one welcomes the debate of the day. This debate too is welcome, if only in that it serves to underline the tough, critical and serious economic situation facing the coal industry and, importantly, its communities. So in their name, I believe this is no time or place to start pointing fingers, for some have and have had a role in all of this. And if I welcome the government motion and the Labour amendment today and oppose Mr Harvey's motion. In terms of the role, for my part, Mary's hairdresser in Ayr asked me some 20 months ago what was to happen in open cast mining in East Ayrshire, where her husband worked. He was to be made redundant. At that time, I probed a bit, but not enough. I fell short. The companies involved fell short in terms of strong and open and appropriate communication. In the Sunday Herald of the 27th of January this year, it was announced, and I quote, that private companies in the open-cast coal industry were planning a massive expansion of open-cast coal mining in Scotland, as according to the Coal Authority. It then goes on to talk of more plans for Dumfries and Galloway, East Ayrshire, the Lothians, Falkirk and the Scottish borders. Their plans fell drastically short. The companies fell short in allegedly not meeting their corporate or community obligations or in taking actions to redeem a positive long-term environmental impact. Cost pressures appear to have had more emphasis than regulated responsibility or obligation. The planning authorities fell short in not meeting their regulatory responsibility, in failures to ensure that restoration bonds were in fact in place and that they were sufficient to secure the needs of restoration. Of course.
Thank you. I'm not au fait with the situation in East Ayrshire or indeed Lanarkshire. However, I am aware of the situation in Falkirk district. Does the member agree with me that if an applicant for an open-cast mine has failed to reinstate a previous site, then the local authority should refuse planning permission for any future sites until the previous site has been reinstated?
Check Brodie.
I understand the emphasis that Mr MacDonald puts on that. We have to look at the whole situation, but in general I have some sympathy with that situation. So the planning authorities fell short, apparently, by not monitoring these bonds and the company's responsibilities. It is regrettable even that regulatory reviews, I believe by the review group, if they had taken place, then they might have highlighted the potential problem earlier. I would suggest, Presiding Officer, that if any situation highlighted the need for the early enactment of a revised planning policy and the Regulatory Reform Act, then this is it, to give an assurance of economic growth and sustainable development working in tandem. And that said, I welcome the review, particularly by East Ayrshire Council, for whose councillors, officers and CEO I have the greatest respect, for them looking at the processes going forward in the management, the implementation and monitoring of new developments. But others also fell short. 1/3 of UK open-cast coal is produced in Scotland, 6 million tonnes, and that has declined by a quarter in the last decade. Half of that goes to a more steeply declining demand in England. But I believe that given the problems and the challenges that are faced down south regarding electricity provision over the next decade, then that, in fact, will change dramatically. Now, half of the coal produced goes to Longannon, which was subject, I believe, to a scurrilous decision by Westminster to forego the plans for clean coal production of electricity. Unless we see, I believe, an imminent change of heart and indeed of technology on CCS, for example, in the Captain Clean or Captain CEP project at Grangemouth, then a question arises regarding the demand for coal for electricity generation and in the achievement of our government's RPP2 emission targets. And I believe the Minister will fight that tooth and nail. Presiding Officer, coal has a future. I believe coal has a significant part in our energy mix, but that future relies on CCS decision, on pricing, on UK demand and worldwide demand. I've only got a few seconds left. Sorry. The future of coal in such situations, however, will demand stronger planning convictions and monitoring of site planning, of restoration of carbon equivalents, of validated customer demand, and above all, community involvement, and indeed, I would seek community part ownership. So while we all fell short, there is no mileage, I believe, Presiding Officer, in finger-pointing today, and that we learn the lessons from this sad and serious situations. So let us support the industry, Scottish Enterprise and the Task Force, and all their component parts going forward. Let us work to preserve employment in the industry directly and on restoration where we can, and reskill those who are to leave the industry, and I welcome the news from the Minister today in terms of those who have been employed. After all, we're looking for 60,000 people in the energy industry, and that should be a means for the reskilling and training of some of the people who are most impacted, particularly in East Ayrshire. And let us ensure that there is a permanent environmental legacy to this whole exercise. Let us encourage the industry then to embrace and work in and with new technologies, such as solar farms, where improved technology is driving costs down significantly, even mitigating the weather impacts. Let us also look at technologies like geothermal energy to produce community district heating networks from the warm water in our disused coal mines. Again, there are investment opportunities available there. Presiding Officer, when one door closes, even partially, another one opens. So let's walk through it. Yes, there's a financial and environmental challenge for coal today, but it does have a future as it sits along and will sit along a balanced energy mix in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you. Now Colin Helen needed to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the opportunity to contribute to the debate this afternoon and to support the motion as amended by Claire Baker. I represent Cowdenbeath, and most would agree that over the years, Fife as a whole has played a massive role in production of coal. At one time, there were at least 61 coal mines in Fife, predominantly deep mines, but with its share of open cast. And I welcome today the statements by the Cabinet Secretary when he informed us about the work of the task force. And I also welcome his news on Muirdean, because the situation at Muirdean is considerably more complex and complicated, owing largely to the fact that the Coal Authority is refusing to assume complete responsibility for the pumping of the nearby Fordell Day level. And this is troublesome because the Coal Authority appears to be legally obligated to oversee pumping activities at the Fordell Day level. So it is of real concern to me, and I am pleased that progress seems to be being made. Westfield, known to many, has been one of the biggest open cast operations in the whole of Europe. The legacy for the local community is that it remains one of the biggest unrestored sites in Europe. 40% of all Scotland's open cast coal production came from this site from 1961 to 1967. Westfield site in Fife, which perhaps summarises all the problems associated with this industry and the way it impacts on people. However, the Westfield story is important. Government appear to be entering a new era when it is seeking to persuade the public that given a strong regulatory system associated with both assessing, approving and monitoring proposals to exploit new sources of energy such as methane coal bed, methane and underground coal gasification, the public should trust the planning system and support proposals to exploit these new sources of energy. However, the history of Westfield site and the history of other unrestored open cast sites in Scotland, England and Wales, when they are written, may provide a salutary warning about whether the public should place such trust in the planning system's ability to properly regulate the exploitation of energy resources. I have followed with interest the briefings here in the Scottish Parliament from Professor Russell Griggs, OBE, who's chair of the Regulatory Review Group and co-chair of the Coal Task Force. I know that the contribution to the Scottish economy is 450 million per annum, and the coal industry estimates are something that for Fife this has translated into millions of pounds and many jobs. I very much hope that when the planners in Fife in particularly, when they look at some of the issues that are really of significance to the local people when considering the way forward, is not only to look at the unrestored sites as sites that should be used only for one specific purpose. I think their plans in Fife should be much more flexible. I think the issue is that up until now in Fife, the Westfield site was designated only for waste to energy, and that to me is a big mistake because it cuts out many other potential developments. And in the report it says in a 392 hectare unrestored open cast site, of the future prospect for this site, Jim Burrow, Senior Manager Development and Buildings, wrote in a report made to the Executive Committee of Fife Council in August 2013 that the site had long mining history, long-held community expectations regarding restoration, unlikely to be realised, other uses on site energy-related. In contrast, this report highlights the long-term costs, past, present and future, that have been realised by the communities living close to the site, which served as a testament to what can happen when the priority is to exploit energy resource by unconventional means. So this means, Minister, Cabinet Secretary, that in your work, this has to be changed. It has to be that our Scottish plans allow for the flexibility of these. And one of the presentations that Professor Grigg came and gave to us, and I thought it was particularly pleasing to see that, was that in East Ayrshire, when they had the Hannistown near Drongan, that was an unrestored site with a restoration bond shortfall. There, I thought their work was particularly creative. They fully restored that to community woodland using funds generated from the grant of planning permissions from housing developments. I thought that was very imaginative, and there were other proposals, not proposals, but other examples cited in that. But if the Challenge Force does anything, I think there's one final point that I would make before I sit down, and that is in terms of lobbying. It has a role to do. And I think, Minister, Cabinet Secretary, you and every parliamentarian in this chamber and every committee that can conceivably get this work under their belt, we need to lobby Europe for a change in policy. One of the things that happened 30 years or more ago in Fife was that we were able to use ERDF funding at that time, not allowed to do it anymore, but at that time we had pit bings on a site known as Lochore Meadows. You should see the photographs of those sites, and I'll give you a presentation at Fife Council if you ask them, of how those pit bings stood then, and the fantastic Lochore Meadows Park that is now, and that cost hundreds of millions of pounds to develop, but it was European funding. Now, we need to make Europe work for us. We need to make sure that these are issues that when it comes to setting agendas in Europe, we have these issues on the table when we're meeting and discussing them, and we want European funding to be enabled to do that. And I would just say to Patrick Harvey and Willie Rennie before I sit down, it's really like Annabel Ewing, sorry. I totally agree with her comments when she was speaking, when she talked about the opportunistic way of Willie Rennie coming to this debate. But it's not the only time he's been opportunistic. You ask the people of Kelty when they had the coal race, who was running amongst the coal race runners when it was election time. It was Willie Rennie that was there running at the time. So talk about opportunism, that's the middle name of Willie Rennie. And so, you know, it's just something that makes me remember that. And I just don't think we should let him off with this. And I think in terms of sustainability... At some point we should be drawing to a close, please. OK, thank you. I'll leave it at that then. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. Now Colin Stewart Stevenson, to be followed by Michael McMahon.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. As the Minister who took the Scottish Climate Change Act through this Parliament, I place that at the heart of my remarks today. Perhaps starting with the subject of carbon capture and storage. Helen Eadie and I are both European enthusiasts, but this is one subject where Europe is not doing well. We have not a single carbon capture and storage facility in the whole of the EU. China has double figures, and even the United States, not the most obvious climate change champions in their engagement on the issue, are making progress on this. So, climate change, something that united us when we took the bill through in 2009 and continues to do so to this day. So we share on objectives, but I think I'm going to differ substantially on means from the two minority groups in this Parliament who are behind the motion that stands against the consensus represented clearly by the majority. It's worth just responding a little bit to Mike McKenzie. I remember when my brother and I were water bailiffs in 1968, we brought our coal into our bothy by sea. We had half a ton of it to keep us warm over the summer. So remote and rural communities often do depend in a very important way on coal. Let me talk a little bit about the positives that can be derived from open cast mining. One of the ministerial visits I made, it was on the 1st of November 2011, at the invitation of the Nith, River Nith Salmon Fisheries Board, was to go down and see the impact, the positive impact on the environment of the open cast industry. I will contrast this with poor examples as well. And the industry there had redirected the Nith on several occasions, but in the restoration had improved the water flow. They had improved the embankments on the river, moving fences out to keep beasts from polluting the river, putting trees in to improve the riverside environment, working with the salmon fishing industry to suspend blasting operations at time when the salmon were spawning. What was the result of that? A 4 times increase in the number of salmon reaching the upper reaches of the Nith. A very successful collaboration between the open cast mining industry there and champions of environmental excellence as represented by the salmon fishers in that area. Now, would that was the universal experience? It clearly is not. We saw the difficulties that were introduced by the proposals to increase track access charges, putting £4 on each tonne that was going to be carried. Fortunately mitigated. I'm not sure that was a great advert, as Claudia Beamish would have us, for collaboration across the borders. It was an issue of vital economic concern to us and of comparatively little concern to the larger UK. Fortunately, the arguments swayed the day, and I think today is an example of rational argument. It's worth looking at what opportunities there are for the industry in future. It is, of course, important that we get to an energy mix that is fully sustainable. But we will get there by stages. We have to continue to exploit non-renewable resources. We have to use fungible resources as an intermediate technology en route to there. They're part of the economic mix. If we destroy the economy, we destroy the economics that will be necessary to take us to a fully renewable future, to a future where we've dramatically reduced our climate change footprint in line with the legislation that we have passed. So the economy and doing the right thing for the environment are inextricably linked. They cannot be separated unless you decide to close down the whole of the human race and all our activities. Well, fair enough. A sterile world without us on it would indeed be a relatively climate change impact-free world. But what worth would that be to us or indeed to the world and all who live on it? Restoration by the coal industry at its best, as I've described, is very, very good indeed, but at its worst is absolutely unacceptably bad. And it's right in this Parliament that we focus on the bad, because it is the bad where we wish to effect change. We have to ensure that the industry has the opportunity to generate the funds that will enable it to do that restitution. I, like others, will drive from time to time up the M90. We see the impact of today's open cast mining. We can see, without being able to quantify it, that it will be substantially expensive to make good what has been done. It's worth perhaps extending the hand of friendship to political colleagues across the chamber. I congratulate Claire Baker and her colleagues for working effectively with the Minister, putting aside some of the tribalism that sometimes contaminates debate in here. And I say this with gritted teeth. I extend that even to Murdo Fraser on the Conservative benches. This Parliament he's not always been kind to the miners. In 1701, we passed a habeas corpus Act. And in that Act, it specifically said this present Act, whose purpose is relatively self-evident, is in no way to be extended to colliers. In other words, they excluded colliers from freedom, and they remained in enslavement to the owners until an Act of 1799. Today we have an opportunity to unite in a positive way that does some good for this industry, while simultaneously propelling us closer to the climate change objectives, which we all agreed on in June 2009. Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call Michael McMahon to be followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. For a very long time, I've campaigned for a balanced energy policy, and I've been concerned that we do not throw all of our energy-producing eggs into the renewables industry, or, on the other hand, reject out of hand the potential contribution that the civil nuclear energy industry could make in ensuring security of supply. I have very real concerns that the contribution that domestic coal reserves can make to securing energy supply is being hampered by the negative perceptions of the industry regularly cultivated by its opponents. The regular omission that the role that future deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies could play in reducing the overall carbon emissions from coal-fired power stations conveniently allows those negative arguments to be slanted against carbon energy sources. Those were the concerns. I'll take you in a minute, Patrick. Those were the concerns I had coming in to this afternoon's debate. Having heard the debate so far, my concerns have moved on to appearing to be on the same side of the argument in favour of the Scottish coal industry as the Conservatives, who did so much to try and destroy it in the past, but equally concerned to see Willie Rennie and Patrick Harvey competing to reach beyond the grave and grab Margaret Thatcher's handbag to finish the coal industry in Scotland off. I'll take you now, Patrick.
Patrick Harvey, full names, please.
If you don't mind, I'll reply to the former point, not the latter one. He mentions CCS, and I've always been a bit maybe's aye, maybe's no on CCS. But can he tell us, now that the Longannet project's been rejected, the Hunterston project's been withdrawn, the Grangemouth project hasn't been selected as one of the two bidders for the DEC competition, and the White Rose project at Drax is the UK's only coal-fired CCS project with a fifth of the capacity of Longannet, is it not clear that if CCS does work, it'll be applied to gas, not coal?
Michael McMahon.
Well, what I won't do is throw my hands up in despair and rule out the potential that that energy could, those technologies could be used to offset some of the concerns that opponents of coal have. I think we have to come to this with a positive agenda. And we work towards it, Patrick. We can share the same objective without necessarily having to disagree on the direction that we go forward. So I genuinely welcome the efforts that the Scottish Government is making to overcome the negative mindset against the surface coal mining industry and recognise the potential contribution that the extraction of indigenous coal supplies can make to both driving economic growth and achieving energy security. And just as I've said that it's wrong for opponents of open cast to close their minds to its potential, I fully recognise that there are genuine issues which relate to the restoration of sites, protection for local communities during excavation and other major considerations that were outlined earlier by Claudia Beamish and Graham Pearson. The consultation announced by the Minister today, I believe, will also be a benefit in looking at what regulation of sites is required to build up the confidence which local communities need when plans for open cast emerges in their areas. The collapse of Scottish coal, as has been stated by others this afternoon, has brought with it a variety of issues around restoration of open cast mines and environmental concerns. So I recognise the importance of the Scottish Coal Industry Task Force in identifying solutions to the problems facing the coal industry in Scotland, and I look forward to seeing what emerges from the consultation in that regard. As someone who comes from a community built around mining and being the grandson of a coal miner, I would on no account wish to diminish the importance that deep coal mining has played in developing the history and psyche of Lanarkshire, and indeed Scotland as a whole. But I am also aware that many miners wanted a better prospect for their sons than a life spent howking coal hundreds of feet underground. And according to many industry analysts, open pit mining is cheaper, safer and mechanically easier to operate. So while open pit mining poses some dangers to mine workers, there are some safety advantages over shaft mining, as an open pit mine is not subject to cave-in accidents, and open pit miners are not exposed to the same explosive poison gas dangers as deep shaft mine workers. So while open pit mining will never be completely safe, it is safer than shaft mining in some ways. It is more than a little disappointing that at a time of increasing demand, that Scottish Coal failed to properly take advantage of the potential for the commercial viability of open cast mining and missed the major opportunity to increase activity and output that was available here in Scotland. Across Britain, surface coal mining directly employs around 2,000 full-time workers and creates an extensive supply chain. The loss of such employment in areas where there are already extremely limited opportunities for skilled and permanent employment is a major challenge, as in addition to providing well-paid and skilled jobs in economically depressed areas, the surface coal mining industry generates significant funds for local economies and provides significant tax contributions via rates to local authorities. Apart from these obvious economic benefits, the surface coal mining industry plays a significant role in the rejuvenation of derelict land. In my own constituency, a location adjacent to the former mining village of Legbrannock, which was the home of James Kirhardy, for a number of years there was an open cast mine. That site is now home to a fine 18-hole golf course designed by Sam Torrance, called, unsurprisingly, Torrance Park. Regrettably, though, a major manufacturing firm in my constituency has been adversely affected by the liquidation of two of its largest open cast customers in the Ayrshire coalfields and lost significant customers for the product it manufactures. As with coal extraction, the reparation work will also require the use of their product. The facility has endured long periods of short-time working, so I would hope that the input of any taxpayer funding can be used to ensure that the use of equipment in the restoration process is manufactured here in Scotland rather than by overseas competitors. I've spoken to the Minister about this. I had a brief conversation with him last week, which I welcomed the opportunity to have, and I hope that he'll look favourably on my request for a meeting to discuss the future prospects of that company in relation to the work that they will hopefully come forward when the restoration works are progressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I now call Willie Coffey to be followed by Roderick Campbell.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Could I firstly say I think it's a disgrace that the Liberal Democrat leader has left the chamber. We were kind enough to listen to his point of view during the debate, but he doesn't appear to want to listen to ours. Could I start my contribution, Presiding Officer, to the debate by thanking our Minister Fergus Ewan for his considerable efforts over a number of months in order to save as many jobs in the industry as possible, and of course to welcome the announcement he made today to consult in establishing more effective regulation of it. The same also goes for my friend and my colleague here, Adam Ingram, who led at the start of the open debate. As many of you will know, as events unfolded over the summer affecting his constituents, Adam was at the heart of all the discussions that took place, despite his own personal illness and the tragic passing of his wife, Jerry. And I think, Presiding Officer, this Parliament should recognise that commitment, going well beyond what should be reasonably expected of anyone. I can also recognise the contribution made by my colleague Aileen Campbell in her capacity as local member for Clydesdale on the task force. Now, Presiding Officer, when we last spoke in debate on the issue facing the open cast industry back in January in Adam Ingram's members' debate, the warning at that time was the proposal from the ORR to introduce the additional freight levy. If anything was going to finish off the industry, it would have been that. But thankfully, as some members have already commented, the ORR stepped back from that and listened to the pleas from many of the members in here and our colleagues in the councils across Scotland too. It's worth remembering, I think, the importance of the industry to Ayrshire, which had about 700 or 60% of the jobs before the crisis occurred. These were good, well-paid jobs. Similar job numbers to those already lost at Johnny Walker in Kilmarnock when Diageo left in 2009. So Ayrshire has had to take quite a blow here, and we really can't afford the prospect of two major industries closing down. The open cast output from Ayrshire last year was over half of the tonnage in Scotland and a quarter of the entire UK tonnage, emphasising the importance of the industry not only to Ayrshire but to Scotland and the rest of the UK too. So that's why it's surely not a serious option to halt all new production as proposed by the Greens and Liberals, who appear to want to say anything these days just to get noticed. I'm grateful to East Ayrshire Council, of course, for providing some very helpful information in advance of the debate today, and I'd like to recognise and welcome Councillors Roberts and Primrose, who are visiting us from East Ayrshire Council, to the Chamber. I think I can report that a substantial document and set of recommendations will be presented to the Council this Thursday. The steps to recovery outlined in that document from East Ayrshire will greatly assist other councils and the Scottish Government in planning the essential restoration work that has to be completed, and I think this will be of huge service in the long run. Chief amongst the figures presented in that report is the current estimated total cost of restoration could be as high as £161 million, and it's been mentioned by several members. We know that that restoration figure is notional and based on costs outlined in the original planning consents, but it does show the extent of the problem that has been building up for many years. The Council has also agreed, as Adam Ingram pointed out earlier, to carry out an independent review led by Jim McKinnon, and the scope of this will be to examine all of the circumstances that led us to this position. It may not be comfortable reading for officers and members of the Council, past and present, but it will be an essential piece of work nevertheless. On a point, Presiding Officer, in relation to our statutory bodies, I think there has to be a clearer and perhaps a strengthened role carried out in future by bodies like SEPA, the SNH, Forestry Commission and others. And I know hindsight is a wonderful thing which we're all blessed with, of course, but in looking back at the history of open cast applications and subsequent monitoring, you could ask whether enough was asked of or done by our agencies to help us protect the public interest and the environment. Perhaps there can be a strengthened role and responsibilities for them in the future, and I would invite the Minister to give some thought to that in his conclusions. In concluding my remarks, Presiding Officer, Ayrshire almost lost another industry over the summer, a historic and important industry that continues to make a vital contribution to our local and national economy. With some deft footwork and no little skill, our Minister, together with colleagues in both Parliaments and councils, averted that disaster. We have made very good progress, but by no means have we reached a happy ending as yet. We are indebted to East Ayrshire Council for the work being undertaken there, and I'm sure all of Scotland will reap the benefit in years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we move on, could I remind members to use full names when referring to each other, please? Roderick Campbell, to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Minister's statement today and thank him for the update on what is, by anyone's standards, the very difficult task of balancing employment issues with environmental issues and the interests of communities in the proximity of open cast mines, let alone with the financial issues at this very difficult time for the coal industry. As the Minister has said, 2 of the largest mine operators in Scotland have folded within the space of just 12 months. The decline of the coal mining industry in Scotland over the past 50 years has been quite rapid, and this year's events prove that we still have a considerable way to go before the industry can offer any form of security to its employees and other stakeholders. My constituency of North East Fife has never, to my knowledge, been home to any collieries. That's not to say that the industry hasn't had a significant effect on the area. In the past, tens of thousands of men from around Fife would have been employed in what was the Kingdom of Fife, or at least West and Central Fife's largest and best-known industry. The historic age of mining in Fife was, of course, brought to life in the film The Happy Lands, which was screened at the Festival of Politics this year and earlier than that in the last parliamentary session. In more recent times, long since the industry's heyday mentioned by Helen Eadie in her speech, open cast surface mining in Fife alone has yielded 171,500 tonnes of coal in the first quarter of the year. That's over 15% of Scotland's total output in the same period and over 7% of the combined UK total. It also employed 145 workers. So the industry remains a considerable force, that's beyond doubt, despite clear trends downwards over the last few decades. Jobs that would be put at risk by Patrick Harvey and Willie Rennie if their amendment were to be passed. Most people in the Chamber will have welcomed the Minister's announcement on the creation of the Scottish Coal Task Force this year, following the demise of Scottish Coal. The task force remit, as the Minister has previously mentioned, is to secure employment and to ensure appropriate restoration work. These tasks are extremely important, and I welcome the work the group has undertaken thus far, including the way it acted as a platform for stakeholders to come together this summer and in order to convince the Office of Rail Regulation that their proposals for freight charges would have devastated the industry in Scotland. Success in making the ORR reverse its decision certainly saved hundreds of jobs across Scotland and helped to strengthen the industry for the long term. But it's not just jobs we need to protect, as important as that is. As parliamentarians, we have a duty to do all we can within the powers we have to ensure that the landscape is protected for now and for future generations of residents and visitors alike. Much has been said about the damage that's often left behind when operations at open-cast mines wind up. Talk of scars on the landscape are understandable. It's worth bearing in mind that our landscape is a huge asset to us in Scotland. Nature-based tourism is worth £1.4 billion to the Scottish economy every year and supports around 39,000 full-time equivalent jobs. According to SNH, 40% of all tourist spending in Scotland is nature-related. And in addition to that, we must remember how adversely communities in close proximity to open-cast mines can be affected, both when the mine is active and when operations have ceased. Restoration, as others have rightly pointed out, is an extremely complex business, and there can be no one-size-fits-all approach. Differing agreements between operators and local authorities, differing access rights, differing topographies and water tables, to name but a few variables, are all matters that must be taken into consideration. In Fife, I'm aware that flooding is a particular issue, and I'm pleased to note that Fife Council has been active in working with operators, SEPA and SMRT, to look at mitigating flooding effects in the short term and agreeing upon the details of resolution for the longer term. With regard to clear-up costs, the Minister and others have talked about the problems so often associated with bonds with local authorities, be it their absence or their inadequacy for dealing with the scale of the clean-up and the costs involved in restoring the mine to as close to its original state as possible through landscaping or the like. This has clearly been a major problem around Scotland, and I'm aware of cases in other parts of the country, such as Midlothian and East Ayrshire, although I'm encouraged to note that Fife's current post-1998 open-cast mines by and large have significant bonds in place. However, whether they are adequate is not entirely clear at this stage. I'm delighted that the Minister has recognised the need to do something about this in the immediate term, and the creation of the Scottish Mines Restoration Trust to assist and guide the restoration process is a very welcome step indeed for stakeholders and the communities affected. However, notwithstanding our collective best efforts, there is still a problem that needs to be addressed in the longer term. Across Scotland, we must learn lessons from the bonds problem. It seems that for many years, going back decades, that bonds were sought but rarely insisted upon. I listened with interest to Claire Baker's comments on Alec Rowley's statement on that issue, and I welcome also the comments of Derek Mackay on the Scottish planning policy. The case, I think, for stronger regulation has been well and truly made, and I'm sure that the Minister's announcement today that the Scottish Government will shortly be consulting on better regulation will offer a great deal of comfort for all stakeholders in the coal industry, especially those affected most when clean-up is put on hold due to a lack of funds. Presiding Officer, where most of us agree that open-cast coal mining remains an important industry in Scotland, coal is not a clean fuel, and work is certainly needed to maximise carbon capture and storage technology. But abandoning the open-cast coal industry would, I believe, be an ill-considered move that would cost jobs. Finally, I welcome the Labour amendment to the bill. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Many thanks. I now call Elaine Murray to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, coal mining is not perhaps the first industry people would associate with my constituency in Dumfriesshire, but it has played an important part in the economy of parts of my constituency, with deep mining having been important in Canonbay and Roundbay. Roundburn, the last of those collieries, closed way back in 1922. And more recently in Upper Nithsdale, the Fault Head mine in Kirkconnell closed in 1968, but unemployment in deep mining continued until the demise of that industry during the 1980s. And then open-cast mining continued to be one of the very few sources of well-paid, skilled employment in Upper Nithsdale. And although it may not have been able to provide the numbers of jobs previously provided in deep mining, nevertheless, in an area whose local economy had been decimated by the demise of the deep mining industry, these jobs have been very important. which is why there was so much local concern when ATH Resources, which operated the Glenmuckloch mine, that was the only remaining open cast mine in Dumfries and Galloway, when that went into administration in December last year, and potentially there would have been the loss of 60 very important jobs. Now, the news was not unexpected, because in May last year, share prices in ATH had halved. Plans for an extension of the site had to be put on hold, and 11 workers had already been made redundant. Fortunately, however, there had been early discussion between various parties with an interest in the site, including the landowners Buccleuch Estates, who were understandably very worried about the possibility that restoration would not happen. And indeed, it was noted that the bond did not cover the costs of restoration at that time. ATH themselves were actually honest about what was happening, came forward to talk to people about the problems they got. And then we also had important discussions with Dumfries and Galloway Council and indeed with the Scottish Government. Because the Scottish Government, I think, did recognise last year that this problem was not a one-off. What was happening at ETH was the beginning of a problem, which then manifested itself in problems at Scottish Coal. And I would like to put on record my personal thanks to one of my constituents, Professor Russell Griggs, for his hard work in facilitating discussions and also in keeping me informed in confidence of progress with those discussions, a confidence which I did respect during that period, but I was very grateful for being kept up to date as to what was happening on behalf of my constituents. And as a result of the work done prior to ATH going into administration, the remaining 60 jobs were not lost. Work continued on the sites, and indeed Hargreaves purchased the debt. And now a restoration plan has been agreed. Interestingly, that includes both forestry and carbon capture and the development of renewable energy sources. Indeed, they're looking at a hydro scheme which would actually be able to store energy from wind turbine schemes, which would be a very interesting development on that site. So now there is hope for job creation on the site instead of job losses. But restoration is, however, dependent on as the Minister said, on the extension of the open cast site to fund it. So if there was no extension, there would be no restoration and there would be no jobs. In my view, that would be a lose-lose-lose situation for my constituents. So the transformation from the serious threat of job losses in an area where unemployment is high to a good news story with the potential for further job creation, I think that is due to people, the various stakeholders and partners, being able to sit round the table together to seek a resolution, both to the employment and to the restoration concerns, before the situation turned into a disaster. Of course, this does not mean that everyone will live happily ever after, and the resolution is still at an early stage, and many of us will be keeping a close eye on developments. Indeed, as Claire Baker referred to, one of the issues of concern is already the application by Hargreaves to Dumfries and Galloway Council to use the local road network to take coal to the railhead at New Cumnock. Now, that will not maybe affect my own constituents as much as it will affect Adam Ingram's constituents, but I too would have significant concerns about increasing heavy vehicle use of the A76, a road which has a number of issues anyhow. The Scottish Coal story, however, was less encouraging. The workforce knew that the company was in trouble, but the sudden announcement on the 19th of April this year, at the end of a shift, that the company was going to administration with the immediate loss of 590 jobs, was shocking, despite 450 workers, including 45 of my own constituents who worked in East Ayrshire, having been placed on notice of redundancy the previous month. Workers had been in discussions with management, but were receiving very little information. MSPs, including myself, the MPs, local councillors, also had all been seeking information with the intent of trying to facilitate and assist with any meetings which might help, but I think everybody had been kept in the dark. And I believe that NUM President Nicky Wilson spoke for many of us when he said he was disgusted with the way the workers had been treated. PACE too were not informed of the forthcoming announcement, so they weren't able to get in there and make contact with the workers prior to them being made redundant. And that made the work of the PACE team considerably more difficult. Most of those workers now are still out of work, but I hope too, as the Minister said, that within the next 6 months, 300 will actually be back in work. Having discovered also that their company had not appropriately accredited their skills, and therefore their opportunities of obtaining employment in other industries such as construction were seriously compromised. And I'm pleased that so much progress has been made with accrediting the skills of those workers through work by MPQC through the Open Cast Mining Task Force, as the Minister referred to in his opening speech. The purchase of some of the sites by Hargreaves does provide hope that some will resume production shortly. Of course, there remain serious concerns about the future of the coaled-out sites previously in the ownership of Scottish Coal, but disclaimed by administrators, and I'll be very careful what I say about that because of the legal issues at the moment. But it is true, as others have said, that the sums of money required to restore these sites runs into millions, and there is at no present any indication how such enormous sums of money might be obtained, and I think that must remain a concern for all of us. Finally, can I say I agree with Adam Ingram, however, that in the future, the Upper Nithsdale area does need a regeneration strategy which actually takes us away from over-reliance on coal and the development of other jobs and training opportunities in an area of high unemployment. So I think we do need to focus on that going forward. Thank you.
Many thanks. And final open debate speaker this afternoon is Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Coal is certainly no stranger to my constituency of Midlothian North and Musselburgh. The proud tradition of coal mining goes back centuries and was the economic lifeblood of the area until the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher destroyed our coal industry and devastated our coal communities. Over the years, I have spoken to so many ex-miners and listened to their always interesting and sometimes hair-raising tales of what life in the pits was really like. After a while, you could almost begin to believe that you had experienced the undoubted camaraderie and the ever-present danger of the day's work. Coal mining was never a safe operation, never a safe occupation. The risk of injury and even death were a constant companion down the pits. Today, however, our debates about open-cast mines, if you like, the successors of the old deep pits, although to me it almost seems we're moving backwards many years in time to a period when shallow open-cast was common. Inevitably, much of this discussion today is around liability for restoration works at the end of the life of the open cast. But there are other aspects to consider also. And firstly, I would like to congratulate the Minister on the work which has been done so far to protect and preserve employment. In these days of recession, every job is a prisoner. The work of PACE in particular appears to have been very effective. I have no doubt that every opportunity has been taken to save jobs in these exceptional circumstances. But we must look forward to the future to ensure that these jobs are still there in 20 or 30 years' time. How to preserve a sustainable coal mining industry in Scotland in the long term is a formidable challenge, particularly pending the implementation of real clean coal technology, including carbon capture. The key issue in viewing the sustainability of this industry is the glut of cheap coal in the international market. The economics surrounding this relatively inefficient and crude means of extracting fuel from the ground are at the moment uncertain. Coal can be produced much more cheaply in Poland and South Africa, and most recently the collapse of the coal industry in Scotland is linked to fracking in America. The resulting surplus in energy supplies has caused a collapse in the demand for coal and the flooding of the UK market and others with cheap imported American coal, which the Americans cannot sell in their own home market. Fracking is in the process of being licensed in the UK by the Westminster Government, who control these licences, and my understanding is that a general licence to frack in the North Sea is in process. Now, leaving aside my particular dismay at that development, let's continue to focus on the economics of coal. Fracking destroyed the viability of the coal industry in America by flooding the market with relatively cheap fuel. Can fracking in the UK have any different end result? Will there not also be a flood of cheap fuel into the UK market? Longannet may close in 2020. Where then will the coal industry sell their bulk product in Scotland?
Murdo Fraser.
Mr. Beattie for giving way. Just so we're clear about it, is he saying that cheaper energy is a bad thing?
Colin Beattie.
I'm not saying cheaper energy is a bad thing for the economy in general, but we're discussing the coal industry here and its place in the future, and clearly the price of energy is a key factor in this. There are uses for coal outside of the bulk product for the Longannet station, but it's byproducts, but nothing like that would support the cost of open-cast pits. To survive, the coal industry needs a long-term plan beyond looking at its current extraction opportunities. And I'm pleased that the Minister is realistically engaging with stakeholders to find a viable way forward. There is another very important issue to consider, or more correctly, very important stakeholders to consider, and that's the local communities in which these developments operate. In my own constituency of Midlothian North and Musselburgh, there is considerable, widespread and well-organised opposition to open-cast coal mining. And I have to say I'm sympathetic to the arguments against having such projects close to local communities. Another real challenge for the industry and the planning authorities is to reassure communities on well-documented health concerns. Considerable evidence exists to show that people living in the close vicinity of such a development suffer a higher level of respiratory ailments than elsewhere. And studies in Douglasdale between 2004 and 2009 show that COPD in affected areas ran at 2.7% of the population, as against a UK average of 1.5%. This cannot but be a concern which needs to be addressed as part of the engagement. I know that many of my colleagues in this chamber share my concern at the threat to the restoration of open-cast coal sites. In my own constituency, I have an example of a very well-restored site as part of the Shewington Works. Now I fear whether the remainder of the site will receive the same treatment. Like many, I am shocked at the possibility that companies may be able to walk away from the liability to restore worked areas. Planning permission and indeed community support was conditional on such works taking place. And it's difficult to believe that the courts would support a proposition so little in the public interest.
Could you please be very careful with the sub judice elements? I
will be, Presiding Officer, and which may well create an unwelcome precedent. Let us hope that the appeal heard last week reverses this decision. Otherwise, the impact will be... I'm
afraid I'm going to have to ask you to move on and to finish your speech and not discuss the case that's pending at the moment.
Very well, Presiding Officer. The action taken by the Scottish Government to create the Restoration Bonds Working Group is genuinely welcome. In the long term, such restoration works will undoubtedly create employment and do a creditable job. However, the documented shortfalls in the bonds previously provided by open-cast operators leaves cause for concern that local authorities, communities and government may be left with an unwelcome and expensive legacy of the open-cast coal industry. There is no doubt in my mind that this industry needs better regulation for its own sake as much as for the communities within which it seeks to operate. Better compliance monitoring at sites and for once an enforcement policy that has some teeth would make a huge difference. I firmly believe that the Scottish Government is doing the right thing, engaging with the industry and other stakeholders to preserve jobs and to look at the sustainable future of this industry. Presiding Officer, for my part, I would like to see a continuing and flourishing coal industry in Scotland which respects and works with local communities, and I commend the Minister and the Scottish Government for the work which they have done to date.
Thank you. We now turn to the closing speeches. Before I do, can I just once again remind members that there is a live court case, and on this issue members should take great care if they're mentioning any details of that case in their own contributions, and that is for members' own benefit. I call Patrick Harvey to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Many members who've spoken may be quite pleased to know that this has been a depressing debate for me to listen to, but there have been one or two lighter moments. Murdo Fraser describing me as a neo-Thatcherite. I thought I was the only one who could make the lady spin in her grave quite that much, but I should take lessons, I really should. Stuart Stevenson beginning his speech by talking about his commitment to climate change legislation, but within 2 minutes deploying arguments that James Delingpole would have been proud of. And as for the Minister, of our many exchanges over the years, I've come to learn that the more animated Fergus Ewing's ham outrage at my position, the more reassured I feel in the strength of that position. But in all of his contribution, the Minister failed to deal directly with the central question of who pays. And this is not simply a matter for current issues, which I will avoid, Deputy Presiding Officer. It goes back such a long time. The list of Scottish open-cast operators who've collapsed is a long one. J. Fenton and Sons, RJB Mining, Caledon Coal Company, Millstone Grit and Fireclay, Coulson Mining, William Grant Mining. The list goes on. This is not a new problem. And it's an issue for the future as well, because Fergus Ewing, as well as other members on the other side of the chamber, have said that restoration is only possible if we allow the creation of an even bigger problem for the future. Restoration can only be paid for by even further destruction. This is simply not an argument that we should accept. The Minister said that he wants to engage with all those who have a constructive interest in sustaining the industry. Would that he was so concerned to sustain the environment that this industry has destroyed and is still destroying. He is very deeply concerned to avoid the destruction of this industry, but he seems content to ignore this industry's destructiveness. Claire Baker focused on jobs, as did many members, and quite understandably so. Like communities the world over who've been forced to live with the environmental harm caused by a destructive industry, many in Scotland have been forced to become economically dependent on the very industries which have so degraded their environment. Labour, for a time, seemed to understand this and made an effort to engage with the concept of environmental justice, and I urge them to return to that. But let's be clear about the question of jobs for the future of Scotland, not for the past, but for the future. A low-carbon, low-energy, resource-efficient economy would be dramatically more job-rich than the one that we have now. And as the comment was made as well, I think, about Alex Rowley saying that we should be extremely careful with future consents. Surely, at the very least, such care means not giving consent until the restoration issue has been resolved. Murdo Fraser seemed concerned about feeding the coal-fired power stations that currently exist and which are still part of our energy mix. The reality is they are reducing their demand, whether through conversion to biomass at Drax, whether through importing less sulphurous coal because of the very necessary environmental regulations that are being put in place, or in some cases, whether because they're simply going to be closing down. The Scottish market for coal will be gone before long. The English market for Scottish coal will be in terminal decline. This is not something that we should be seeking to prop up for the sake of it. The Scottish Open Cast... Yes, I'll take an intervention.
Elaine Murray.
By your assertion, actually, because I've actually currently got 2 companies now looking at the revival of the deep mines at Canby, which actually is a very good quality coal. So I'm sure that these companies would not be interested if there was no future for the industry.
Patrick Harvey.
Well, as far as I'm aware, the Longannet is scheduled for closure by 2020, and that's included in the government's own national planning framework. The Scottish Open Cast Communities Alliance, their view, as circulated to members, is very clear, and it deserves to be heard in Parliament, not just the industry's view to be heard here. I'd say it also deserves to be heard around the table, both at the Task Force and the Restoration Trust. The communities ought to have a seat at those tables and with the full freedom that they need to communicate properly with the communities that they represent. Mike Mackenzie, Michael McMahon and others made comments about carbon capture and storage. And I dealt with the reality that it's likely to be applied to gas, not coal, if it can be shown to work. But even if it was to be applied to coal, the future possibility of the availability of CCS technology could only be used to justify burning coal once that technology is available. It can't be used to justify burning it now. There are also mentions in relation to the issue of fracking and the impact that's having economically on this market. Most recently, Colin Beattie, I think, talked about that. But fracking and coal bed methane raise for me another concern, another future concern. Will that industry be yet another iteration of the same problem? Will operators be held to their future environmental responsibilities? Or will communities in the likes of Earth and elsewhere be told, as open cast communities have been told already, that bonds have fallen short or that companies are off to court to abandon their responsibilities? The case, it seems to me, is very clear for an inquiry, not only in terms of the finances of restoration, but also the possible breach of European environmental law. In order to comply with European environmental law, the government must either ensure that the obligations are met in full by the industry and that the industry is held tightly to those obligations, or it must pick up the tab from public funds. Those are the 2 choices. And if the Scottish Government isn't minded to hold an inquiry into that, I think at the very least the case is clear for an inquiry by the Auditor General into the finances of this entire situation. Deputy Presiding Officer, in closing, it seems to me that the question which hasn't been addressed by the Minister, but which does need to be asked, is why are we continuing to support an industry that routinely trashes the environment, is openly contemptuous of environmental laws, facilitates the biggest polluters in the country and has no future? That question remains to be answered.
Thank you very much. I now call on Alex Johnston with 7 minutes.
Let's take a moment, draw breath, pause and apply some common sense to this discussion that we've had today. Deputy Presiding Officer, I don't have to tell you that the Conservatives have a difficult relationship with the coal industry. Perhaps a more difficult one with the Scottish coal industry. We've heard it mentioned a number of times during remarks today about the impact the previous Conservative governments may have had. But, as many will have heard when I spoke in the debate that earlier this year paid tribute to Margaret Thatcher, I'm one of the people who believe that it was Arthur Scargill's determined drive to bring down a Conservative government that cost us our deep mining industry. And if you look at the mines, even in the Edinburgh area, that were closed and never reopened due to flooding, due to lack of maintenance, you realise that there's a more complicated story to be told here. The truth is that Scotland is a country well endowed with energy sources and that coal was one of the biggest. Scotland's coal reserves are still immense and they will be exploited in different ways as time goes on. The deep mines are gone and in recent years it has been open cast that allowed Scotland to maintain its huge coal production. But now we've had a problem. The value of coal has undermined the industry and it's created all the problems that we address today. There are options that have been brought forward during this discussion, like, for example, taking action to push up the price of coal. Well, unfortunately, we can't consider that as a route to deal with this problem because, as we know, many of us have repeatedly debated in this chamber the fact that energy costs are already too high. Whether you're in fuel poverty or whether you're an industry trying to maintain your position in a world market, energy costs are absolutely key to the long-term future. As a result, we must consider how we proceed in such a way as to make sure that we can keep energy cost-effective in Scotland. Now, as far as our coal is concerned, there are alternatives. We could, of course, go down the road of carbon capture and storage, which would deal with the problem of carbon dioxide emissions. There are also those who believe that in the long term, we may actually find ways to exploit our coal reserves by bringing the energy up and leaving the carbon where it is. But for the long term, we have to deal with the problems that we have here today. And we've had a number of speakers that have contributed towards that discussion. There was a very detailed, in fact at times quite moving speech by Adam Ingram, who talked about the situation in East Ayrshire. Now, East Ayrshire did have a very successful mining and open cast mining industry, and the collapse of Scottish Coal and Aardvark have, of course, undermined that quite significantly. I would like to pay tribute to the way in which East Ayrshire Council has taken up the cudgels and gone ahead and prepared its own report, Open Cast Mining in East Ayrshire, Steps to Recovery, which I believe will be published on Thursday of this week. I look forward to hearing ministerial reaction to that, to see if that can act as a way in which we can take forward dealing with the collapse of open cast mining. Could I also particularly thank, on behalf of the Conservatives, Councillor Tom Cook of East Ayrshire, who has been our contact in that area to keep us informed about what is going on. But we've also heard some interesting argument, sometimes within the same speech. We heard Claudia Beamish facing both ways as far as the priority of coal is concerned, reminiscing with a good degree of warmth, I thought, about the good old days of the miners' strike, and then talking about how important it was that we did not allow coal to contribute to gas emissions and global warming. But of course, one of the big... indeed, I shall.
Could you check if your card's in, please? It would help. Claudia Beamish.
Would the member, I think the member missed the point, because the point I was making was that there needed to be a recognition of the need for jobs in the coal industry now for beleaguered communities, but that for the future, the range of options had to be looked at in relation to the shift to a carbon economy from fossil fuel, and that people needed support in that to be trained or retrained.
Alex Johnston.
Indeed, but the one thing we cannot do is both at the same time. Patrick Harvey's contribution to this debate has been quite substantial, and I will turn to the main issues surrounding the Green and Liberal Democrat amendment before I close. However, we've heard Patrick Harvey today actually, I believe, object to subsidies for rail transport. Perhaps that's a first on his part. But, but we have to remember that we cannot sacrifice the jobs of so many who are dependent on that industry simply to take us towards his green revolution. Annabel Ewing, who was mistaken by one speaker for Annabel Goldie, a mistake that surely nobody else could make, was in a position, or took a position, which I can agree with entirely. She pointed out that in these difficult times for open cast mining, a one-size-fits-all approach would not work. The answer to this problem is very complex, and that's why the Minister must take this forward in the way which he has set out in his opening speech. In addition, it's important, of course, that we all work together. The Conservatives, of course, as was pointed out by my colleague Murdo Fraser in his opening remarks, will support the government motion tonight, and we will support the Labour amendment. And we are prepared to go forward on that united front. However, it is a disappointment to me that we find ourselves today in a position where the Greens and the Liberal Democrats have taken a quite isolated position, and one which, try as I might, I cannot work out how they believe it will help at this difficult time. To call on the Scottish Government to call an immediate halt to all new open-cast coal developments and to ensure that the industry fulfils its legal and moral obligation is, I believe, a contradiction in itself. If we kill this industry stone dead, and that's what I believe this action would do, then we simply are left with the problem. The liability for clearing up the mess of open-cast coal mining may well be attributed to one or other of the individuals involved, but if there's no money and no companies, then nothing will be done.
You must conclude now, please.
In order to take this forward, we must ensure that this industry survives and that it is encouraged to accept its responsibility. I commend the action of the Government, I commend the action of the Minister, and I look forward to seeing how this is worked out in the longer term. In the meantime, it will have our support at decision time.
Thank you very much. And now Colin Sarah Boyack with up to 9 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. This has been a pragmatic debate. It reflects the complex challenges that we all have to face, and it does indicate that we need to work together in the interest of our constituents. And I believe members have engaged in this debate with that appetite and that overall attitude. I think while we need to be pragmatic, though, we do also need to have a few points of principle in mind. And for me, we should, as a Parliament, be guided by our principles of sustainable development, about how we run our economy now, the long-term impact of our economy, but also how we factor in environment and social issues as well, and social impacts. And environmental justice has to be a key part of that worldview. And I thought that was very ably demonstrated by the speeches from both Claire Baker and Claudia Beamish. Because what's happened in our coal industry should worry us. It should concern us all. The question mark over jobs and instability in the industry referred to by Claire Baker has been coming for some time, and it represents a double whammy for local communities. They've lost jobs in some of our most disadvantaged communities, which already have much higher rates of unemployment, as Graham Pearson mentioned. But the loss of commitment and funding for restoration projects has been a body blow for many of those communities who are now deeply worried about their future. And the bonds and guarantees which were undertaken given by companies, without which planning permission would not have been granted, has to be a concern of us in this chamber. And that's why our amendment focuses on the need for the Scottish Government to review the policy advice which is currently contained in the draft SPP, which closed for consultation this summer. And that's why we wanted to make a positive contribution to debate, to flag up the fact that because the Planning Minister has extended the time before that SPP is concluded, it does give us the chance to actually look at that section of the SPP. We also want to flag up that discussions about the future of the coal and other extractive industries need to include those trade unions involved in the industry, both on the mining side and in relation to transport. And it's concerning that we're not just losing jobs in the coal sector, but we've also seen contracts going from rail haulage to revert back to road transport on road. That is bad news for communities, and that is something that this Parliament at its very start focused on, about transferring that transport off-road and onto rail, because it's bad news for local communities to move back. Our amendment does refer to what happens next in terms of planning, and we certainly thought that the establishment of the task force was very welcome. But a key issue I think we all need to address our minds to is the way forward on restoration, both in terms of existing sites, but also in terms of the longer-term development for new proposals for development. Because there are current problems about pollution, and Helen Eady was absolutely right to raise them. Those issues are worrying communities now. That's not even looking at forward-term issues. And that's why, although we haven't called for a moratorium, we have called for guidance to be addressed in the new SPP. That is absolutely crucial, because the existing document is short on help to local authorities who've seen the agreements that they had blown out the water. And with companies going bust and their successor companies attempting to shelve their obligations to carry out restoration work, communities are rightly angry. So we do need, not just now, thank you, we do need that guidance from the Scottish Government. And I think today's announcement is important, and we need to seize the opportunity in this one. So can I ask that ministers consider continuing the task force inclusive approach as they move forward? I think it's vital that all voices are drawn into this discussion. Voices from communities and voices from local authorities. We need to learn from good practice as well as failure. And I thought that the comments made by Claudia Beamish about some of the best practice in West and Mid Lothian is important to take on board. I think the issue about site surveys and restoration guarantees are absolutely crucial, because in the future, sites need to be run to the best of standards, and they need to be progressively and appropriately restored. And I think it is important that local authorities have the capacity to tap into specialised financial advice, because we all know that the current financial settlement for local authorities is seeing them lose staff. And I think there are some key issues that we need to address here. I'd ask the Minister to look particularly at the suggestion from the Scottish Open Cast Coal Communities Alliance that local authorities should be allowed to introduce fees for monitoring and enforcing mineral consents. They point out that that work is both complex and underfunded. And when the Planning Minister earlier this year suggested that local authorities should be allowed to raise the cost of planning fees, we on this side agreed with that. It is very expensive, and it's important that when planning authorities carry out this work, that they are properly funded. So I'd ask the Minister to consider that. Many members have talked about the East Ayrshire situation, and I know from representations I've had directly from the East Ayrshire Labour Group that they are worried that the Council simply doesn't have the resources to deal with the scale of the crisis that they are facing. And as Graham Pearson said, the Council will be discussing the matter this week. And the paper from Council officials highlights that they're seeking support from both the UK and Scottish governments to find a way to support the restoration of sites in East Ayrshire. And if Willie Rennie had been in the chamber and had he taken any interventions, mine would have been, surely he cannot rule out involvement from the UK government. My colleague Sandra Osborne raised the issue with the UK government, and given that 48% of the UK's open cast coal comes from Scotland, surely this is something that we need positive engagement from the UK government. Those communities have been devastated because of the unsustainable financial settlement they have from the Scottish Government in this year's budget on one hand, but on the other hand, Willie Rennie is telling them not to speak to the UK Government. So I think there's a real need for governments at every level to be working with each other to see what practically they can do to support our local authorities. and in the end our local communities that we all represent. Now, it's welcome in the new planning guidelines that cumulative impact will be a material issue for planning authorities. But I think we need to ask how the existence of sites without current commitments on restoration will be played in and given weight by the Scottish Government if they're in the locality of new proposals. Will local authorities be expected to refuse planning permission until existing sites have been addressed, or will this be something that they can reflect in their consideration on existing planning applications? I think this is quite an important issue because local communities have a right to know what kind of environmental protection they can expect in those circumstances, and local authorities need to have a discussion with Scottish Government to know to what extent they will be backed in planning decisions if companies are not happy about this in the way that their planning applications are dealt with. There is a real need for confidence for local authorities going forward that the Scottish Government will be there to back them up. And I think we need a transparent policy framework. We need a policy that is fair. It needs to be valid and enforceable. So I would be interested to hear to what extent ministers have had those discussions with local government, to what extent they've had discussions with the UK government, and how the Scottish ministers see a role for the Coal Authority and DEC in that process. I think the intergovernmental challenges here are actually quite acute, and they need to be taken on board. And I think one of the reasons that we need to get this right is it's not just about the coal industry, although that has rightly been the focus for most of us today. There are also challenges for other extractive and environmental industries as well, because some of these principles about restoration apply, whether it's fracking, whether it's biomass, or whether it's coal. And that's why I think RSPB and Friends of the Earth are right to put that on our agenda in terms of their briefing, because our economy as a whole is still in economic difficulty, and access to money is an issue for companies. Borrowing has become more expensive, and that's why the long-term financial viability is such a challenge for local authorities to measure accurately, because some of these issues are about global changes, and it is actually something that they do need support, and they do need support in terms of strategic advice. So we need to work together on this. We need to be collaborative. We need to work across the Parliament. I want to finish on Helen Eadie's comments about restoration. ERDF funding was powerful. It enabled restoration projects that have been successful in turning around communities. But we also need to look at these issues in the long run. We will need new jobs as our economy moves on to lower carbon energy sources. And that's why it's not a choice between low carbon and supporting our coal industry. Those challenges go hand in hand. And we on our side are up for the discussion to make sure that we work with our local communities and governments of all levels to make sure we solve this challenge, because we cannot let it fall through market forces failing. Thank you,
Thank you very much. I now call the Minister, Fergus Ewing, to wind up, and you have until 5 o'clock.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by welcoming to the Chamber Councillor Jim Roberts, a member of the task force, together with his colleague Councillor Stephanie Primrose, who have sat through the whole of the debate this afternoon, and also pay tribute to their colleagues, both the council members from various parties and the trade union officials on the task force. Presiding Officer, without their contributions, rooted in the community, experienced in the industry, we would not be where we are now. We would not have achieved the successes that we have achieved now. And we've had, I think, 4 or 5 meetings of the task force. And also, I'd say that Derek Mackay and myself were grateful for the invitation extended by the Chief Executive and Convener of East Ayrshire Council to see for ourselves some of the impacts that they have in the open cast mines. And we spent the best part of a day doing that, contrary to what Mr Rennie, who is not here, implied in his statement. So I welcome and thank all of the members of the task force across the parties in this chamber for their contribution. I don't think I've ever chaired a bigger task force, because there was at one point nearly 60 people. So I don't know if I can prune down the numbers if there's any volunteers. But I want to say that going forward, there's a number of strands of work that I plan to do with all parties in this chamber in an open and cooperative fashion. Firstly, I'm due to meet with bondholders to discuss some of the difficulties which have arisen, and I'll be working closely with the councils in that regard. Secondly, Plainly, the litigation is sub judice, presiding officer, but I will continue to engage with the liquidators as is appropriate. Thirdly, I will continue to explore with the UK Government whether the very substantial contribution paid from the industry to the Coal Authority of, I believe, most recently 17p per tonne, whether only 1p of which is funded to the Coal Authority, whether of any of that money, which amounts to a great number of millions of pounds, can be used in part to meet the restoration costs. Many members have rightly said that the industry has responsibility. Well, the industry has made that contribution. At the moment, I'm not sure exactly what that contribution has done, where it's gone, what it's for. The vast majority of it has gone straight into the Consolidated Fund. I'm not making any political points, but I think the Chamber would expect me to pursue that, and pursue that I will. And lastly, in respect of the work going forward, as well as holding further meetings of the task force, at least 2, possibly more as required, we will see. I would like to confirm the assurance I gave to Adam Ingram, who himself has worked tirelessly in the task force, that we have already asked Scottish Enterprise in a letter from myself to Lena Wilson at the outset of these problems, following the administration of the 2 companies, to look particularly at the predicament facing East Ayrshire. Adam Ingram asked for that assurance. I've given it to him. I personally will go to attend meetings, the detail of which we've already had some discussions about, Mr Ingram and myself. And Willie Coffey was quite right to highlight that the Ayrshire communities have already been affected severely by the aftermath of the Diageo closures. So we do recognise, Mr Swinney, who's here in the Chamber, also recognises the severe predicaments faced in East Ayrshire, and at a strategic level the need to diversify into other areas, but also work with the existing employers in that respect. In respect of Claire Baker's remarks and the Labour amendments comments about planning, could I say that the current policy, we believe, is quite clear, but we have already consulted over the summer on slight amendments, and we feel that the issue is the operation of the policy locally that would benefit from further advice and guidance. And I will, or Mr Mackay, will write, following this debate, to Claire Baker to give as much detail of that as we have at the moment. So we will explore that further during the consultation process. Presiding officer, in last month in August, despite the issues and the redundancies in the sector, Scottish open cast mines produced 448,000 tonnes of coal. By contrast, there was only 332,000 produced last month in England. The industry sustains 1,500 direct full-time jobs and 3,000 indirect full-time jobs. It contributes around £500 million to the economy per annum. Last year, Scotland produced 4.8 million tonnes of coal. There are at least 12 million tonnes of reserves remaining, possibly much more. The industry provides average salaries of £42,000, well above the Scottish average of £22,000. One wonders where on earth jobs offering such salaries would be found, were the industry to be closed, as the Liberals and the Greens would have if their amendment were to be approved, which fortunately it will not be. In the winter, coal regularly generates around 45% of the UK's electricity, a point made, I think, by Conservative and Labour members and SNP members as well, and over half of our coal is exported to England, contributing to the UK's electricity generation system.
Alex Johnson.
I think you're slightly ahead of yourself. Coal going to England is not technically an export yet.
Minister.
Well, I'm an optimist, so... Longannet Coal Power Station, contrary to what Mr Harvey said, is expected to keep generating electricity until 2023. Also, contrary to what Mr Harvey said, he's wrong to say that there will not be a community representative on the SMRT. They're recruiting one at the moment, as I thought he was aware. No. When CCS... I'll let you in a minute. Just hang on a second, all right? Now, when CCS becomes commercially proven, this will allow clean coal thermal generation to continue for many years to come. When I attended the Council of Ministers meeting with the UK delegation on November 11, there was a presentation to the EU Council of Ministers by the lady who heads up the International Energy Authority. Her analysis pointed out, and I've never seen any information that contradicts this from anyone, that unless CCS as a technology is applied to power stations throughout Europe, it's extremely difficult to see how the EU emissions targets can actually be achieved. And if one thinks about it, the proposition is really rather straightforward. A very substantial proportion of carbon emissions derive from gas and coal-generated electricity. If those are abated, that will make an enormous contribution to reducing our emissions target. If they can't be reduced, then either fossil fuels cease to be used, as Mr Harvey would want, which is not possible in the short term, whereas we transition to a low-carbon economy, or we have CCS technology. Now, what I find it difficult to understand about the position adopted by Mr Rennie and Mr Harvey is this. Since CCS is a sine qua non of achieving the reductions to carbon emissions, why are they opposed to it? And this quandary is even more acute, given that I found out when the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute came to this country in the summer, and when I hosted a reception for them, I learned in the USA, for example, the equivalent of the WWF supports carbon capture and storage. So, since this is the route to reducing carbon emissions, why are they opposed to it? Because this would allow their objectives to be achieved. In fact, it's the only way that their objectives can be achieved. Well, I suppose I will give way since I'm a good sport.
I'm glad the Minister, who's such a good sport that he spent the last few minutes misrepresenting my position, has chosen to give way. He knows very clearly that I'm not opposed to CCS. I have a serious question mark as to whether it is technically and commercially viable. If it is, then when it is, we may be able to burn coal without emitting CO2 emissions. Can I return him to the point about the community representative, which is what I wanted to intervene on him in the first place? Can he give us an assurance that that community representative will be entirely free to communicate about all issues with the communities they represent? Because otherwise, they're completely incapable of doing the job.
I know it was a lengthy intervention, but Minister, if you could finish by 5, it would be appreciated.
Thank you. Well, I can't, because it's not up to me to constrain the individual contributions of people. It's called liberty of expression. I wouldn't attempt to do that. And the SMRT is independent of the government anyway, so it's not within my power nor in my desire to prevent them speaking out as they fit. I mean, what a ludicrous suggestion. Presiding officer, it is plain, and it is absolutely clear, I think, really, to all of those who have contributed from the SNP, Labour and Conservative benches, that we see in this Parliament today something that I can't remember ever having come across before in 14 years of membership of this Parliament. And that is that not just Mr Harvey, but also one of the putative major parties, the Liberal Democrats, is in an amendment, its amendment, proposing a measure, namely the halting of further coaling, which would have the effect of closing down a whole industry in Scotland. I cannot remember, as a member of this Parliament, any putatively major party bringing forward an argument which I think anyone who is capable of logic would see would have the inevitable consequence of handing out redundancy notices to thousands of people in our country. It's a matter of profound regret that the Liberal Democrats should adopt such a policy, and I wonder whether the UK colleagues would actually agree with it. In closing, could I just pay respect to all of the workers in this industry and assure them that on my watch there will continue to be surface coal mining in Scotland.
That concludes the debate on open cast mining in Scotland, coaling and restoring. We now move to the next item of business, which is 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 7712.2 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 7712 in the name of Fergus Ewing on open cast mining in Scotland, coaling and restoring. Be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of vote on amendment number 7712.2 in the name of Claire Baker is as follows. Yes, 106. No, 6. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 7712.2 in the name of Patrick Harvey, which seeks to amend motion number 7712 in the name of Fergus Ewing on open cast mining in Scotland, coaling and restoring be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is not agreed. Therefore, move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 7712.1 in the name of Patrick Harvey is as follows. Yes, 6. No, 106. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 7712 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended on open cast mining in Scotland, coaling and restoring be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 7712 in the name of Fergus Ewing as amended is as follows. Yes, 105. No, 6. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Any members to leave in the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.